the scent that came first. Ah, lavender, you say, settle yourself in now. There is no haste in this shop, no urgency that cannot wait while we speak of small purple flowers and the long memory of humankind. We have time enough, you and I, to consider matters that have unfolded over centuries. I am an old man now, my hands spotted with age and stained with the tinctures of 50 years at this work, and I have learned that some knowledge cannot be hurried. It must be turned over slowly, like good earth in spring, examined from all sides, appreciated for what it is and what it has been. And so tonight we shall speak of lavender. Not quickly, mind you, not in the rushed manner of the young apothecary who thinks he knows a thing because he has read it once in a book. No, we shall speak of it properly, as it deserves, attending to each detail as though we were sorting the dried flowers themselves, stem by stem, before we discuss the particulars of cultivation, before we examine the chemistry that the learned men debate in their universities, before we catalogue the 1,001 uses to which this plant has been put. We must begin where all true knowledge of lavender begins. We must begin with the scent. You see, lavender was not discovered through measurement or analysis. It was not found through the careful notation of latitudes and longitudes, though we shall certainly discuss such things in time. No, lavender announced itself to humanity through the nose, through that most ancient and most honest of our senses, long before any scholar thought to press it between the pages of a book, long before any physician thought to distill its oils or powder its flowers. Someone, somewhere, perhaps tending their goats on a hot Mediterranean hillside, crushed a purple sprig between their fingers and lifted it to their face, and they smelled something remarkable. That is where lavender begins, you understand, not in the written record, not in the botanical treatise, but in that single, unrepeatable moment when a human being first encountered its scent and found it pleasing, found it memorable, found it worthy of bringing home, of planting near the dwelling, of returning to again and again. Now we know from the fragments that remain to us, from the old writings and the older traditions, that lavender has been known to humankind for more than 2,500 years, 2.5 millennia. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. When we speak of lavender's history, we are not speaking of something recent, something modern. We are speaking of a relationship between plant and person that stretches back beyond the memory of any living tradition, back into times we know only through archaeological findings and ancient texts. The plant itself grew wild, you see, long before anyone thought to cultivate it in tidy rows. It grew wild around the Mediterranean, that great sea which is the center of so much of our history. It grew on the hillsides of what the ancients called the Middle East, in lands whose names have changed many times since lavender first perfumed the air there. And it grew in parts of India, far to the east, where it flourished in its own particular way, adapted to its own particular soil and sun. Wild lavender, growing on rocky slopes, in poor soil, under a hot sun. This is important to understand, and we shall return to it many times, for lavender is not a plant that demands rich feeding or constant attention. It is a plant of the rough places, the overlooked places. It thrives where other plants might struggle, but I am getting ahead of myself. We are speaking now, not of cultivation, but of that first encounter, that first recognition. Imagine, if you will, those ancient peoples moving through their landscape. They knew their plants, of course. They knew which roots could be eaten, which leaves could poison, which barks could reduce a fever. They had learned these things through long experience, through trial and error, through knowledge passed from elder to child across generations, and among all these useful plants they encountered lavender. And what did lavender offer? It did not fill the belly. It did not make a strong fiber for weaving. It did not provide timber for building. What it offered was something more subtle, something that could not be measured in the same way. It offered its scent, And that scent, it seemed to the ancients, was worth preserving. The very name we use for this plant speaks to how it was first valued. Lavender, we call it in our English tongue, and this word, the scholars tell us, comes from the Latin. The Romans, those great builders and conquerors, had a word, lavar, to wash, to cleanse, to make pure. Now, whether the plant was named for the practice or the practice named for the plant, this I cannot say with certainty, and the old texts do not speak clearly on the matter. But what we know is this: from the earliest times we can trace, lavender was associated with washing. The Romans used it in their baths. Those elaborate structures they built wherever their empire reached. They understood that the scent of lavender, when added to hot water, when released by steam, created an atmosphere of cleanliness and calm. Think on that word a moment. Lava, to wash, not merely to make wet, not merely to apply water to a surface, but to wash, which implies a purification, a removal not just of visible dirt, but of something more. The Romans bathed frequently, far more than many peoples who came after them, and they brought lavender into that ritual of bathing. The scent became inseparable from the sensation of being clean, and it was not only in the grand public baths that lavender found its place. In the homes, in the private quarters, lavender was used to scent the laundry. Imagine the servant, if you will, washing the household linens, the togas, the tunics, and adding to the washing water a quantity of lavender flowers or lavender-scented oil. The cloth would absorb that scent. When the fabric was dried in the sun, when it was folded and put away, it would carry with it that distinctive smell. So when the Roman citizen dressed in the morning, when they lay down to sleep at night, when they used a cloth to dry their hands or face, they encountered lavender. The scent became woven into the fabric of daily life, into the most ordinary and most intimate moments. This was not lavender as medicine yet, not lavender as a studied substance. This was lavender as experience, as sensation, as a marker of domestic order and personal care. The linens, yes. This is worth dwelling upon, for the practice continued long beyond Roman times. Indeed, in my own childhood, and I am old enough that my childhood reaches back into the previous century, my own mother and grandmother would lay sprigs of dried lavender among the folded linens in the chest. The scent would permeate the fabric over time, subtly, gently. When a sheet was taken out to be used, it carried that scent into the bed. When a tablecloth was spread for a meal, it brought that fragrance to the table. This is how lavender was known, you see. Not through grand declarations or medical treatises, but through these small, repeated encounters, through the sheet that smells of summer even in winter, through the bath that soothes after a long day's labor, through the subtle sweetening of the air in a closed room. From the beginning, from those first 25 centuries ago, lavender was associated with three things. Let me say them clearly, for this is the foundation upon which all later understanding is built. First, cleanliness, not merely the absence of dirt, but a positive quality of freshness, of purity, of order. Lavender marked the difference between the soiled and the clean, between the neglected and the cared for. Second, calm. Even before anyone understood why, it was observed that lavender seemed to quiet the mind, to ease the body. The bath scented with lavender was more relaxing than the bath without it. The room perfumed with lavender was more peaceful than the unscented room. This was simply noticed, simply known, long before any explanation was attempted. Third, the sweetening of air. In times when many smells were unpleasant, when sanitation was poor, when illness carried its own particular odors, when human habitation in close quarters produced inevitable stenches, lavender offered an alternative. It did not merely mask bad smells, though it could do that. It provided a positive scent, something actively pleasant, something that made a space more bearable, more human, more homelike. These three things, cleanliness, calm, and the sweetening of air are what lavender meant to the ancients. They are what lavender meant before science, before systematic study, before anyone thought to ask why lavender had these properties. It was experienced, you see, before it was analyzed. And this, I think, is crucial to understand as we begin our long examination of this plant. Lavender was not discovered in a laboratory. It was not the result of careful experimentation. It was discovered in life, in the daily round of human activity, by people who were simply trying to make their lives more pleasant, more comfortable, more bearable. They noticed that crushing lavender and adding it to water created a pleasant scent. They noticed that hanging lavender in a room made the room smell better. They noticed that sleeping near lavender seemed to promote rest. These were not scientific observations in the sense we mean today. They were simply things that were noticed, things that were remembered, things that were passed along. And because they were passed along, because people continued to use lavender in these ways, because the knowledge was kept and added to and refined across generations, lavender became part of human culture. It became one of those plants, like wheat or olive or grape, that is so entangled with human history that we can hardly imagine that history without it. When we speak of ancient temples and the incense burned there, lavender was often present. When we speak of ancient homes and how they were kept, lavender played its part. When we speak of ancient medicine, even in its earliest, most rudimentary forms, we find lavender appearing, valued, sought after. All of this long history, all of this human use and human knowledge began with scent, began with that moment when someone first experienced lavender's fragrance and recognized it as something worth preserving, worth cultivating, worth passing along to the next generation. We shall, in the segments to come, speak at great length about how lavender came to be cultivated, about which varieties grow best, in which soils, about the proper time for planting and the proper time for harvest. We shall speak about the chemistry of lavender, about the oils it contains, about what modern science has learned regarding why it has the effects it does. We shall catalogue its uses, medical and cosmetic and culinary and domestic, until you may think there is nothing about lavender that has not been said. But let us never forget, as we proceed through all that detail, that lavender first came to us as a gift of the senses. It came as scent. It came as an experience. It came not as something we sought out and analyzed, but as something that found us, that caught our attention, that made us pause in our work and breathe deeply and say, that is good, that is worth remembering. This is the proper beginning, this is where we must start, with the scent that came first, before the science, before the scholarship, before all the accumulated knowledge that we shall now, slowly and carefully, over many hours, examine together. Rest yourself. There is no hurry. We have much to discuss, and we shall discuss it all, piece by piece, in good time. Sacred smoke, and eternal bodies now then. Having established how lavender first came to human attention through the simple medium of scent, through its presence in the daily round of washing and cleaning and the keeping of homes, we must turn our attention to matters more solemn. More solemn. We must speak of how lavender moved from the ordinary into the sacred, from the household into the temple, from the concerns of daily life into the great mystery that lies at the end of all life. I speak, of course, of death, and more particularly of how the ancient peoples, those Egyptians who built monuments that still stand after thousands upon thousands of years, incorporated lavender into their most holy and most careful practices surrounding death and burial. This is not a cheerful subject, perhaps, but it is not a morbid one either, not if we approach it properly. Death was, to the ancients, not an ending to be feared and pushed away from thought, but a transition to be prepared for, to be honored, to be treated with the utmost care and attention. And in that care and attention, lavender played a part. Let me begin with what we know, with what has been discovered in our own time, through the opening of ancient tombs, and the careful study of what was found within them. The Egyptians, you see, did not bury their dead as we do, simply wrapped in cloth and placed in the earth. No, they believed, and believed most fervently, that the body must be preserved, must be kept intact for the journey into the afterlife. And so they developed the most elaborate methods of preservation that the world has ever known. Embalming, they called this practice, though the word comes down to us through Greek and then Latin. The process itself was complex, taking many weeks, involving the removal of organs, the drying of flesh, the wrapping in linens, and most importantly for our purposes, the application of oils and ointments and perfumes. These ointments were not simple things. They were carefully compounded, made from many ingredients, each chosen for its particular properties. And among these ingredients we find lavender, or rather, we find substances that contain lavender, that carry its distinctive chemical signatures, that speak to its presence even after thousands of years have passed. Now, I must be careful here to speak precisely. We do not find intact lavender flowers in these ancient preparations, preserved as they were picked. The Egyptians were too sophisticated for that. They extracted, they distilled, they combined. What we find, when the modern chemists analyze these ancient ointments with their new methods, are residues, chemical traces, molecular fingerprints, as it were, that point back to lavender as one of the source materials. These residues, these traces, have been found in many Egyptian burial sites, but most remarkably, most famously, they were found in the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. Now there is a name that echoes down through time. King Tut, as the common folk have come to call him, that boy who died so young, whose tomb was found nearly intact in our modern era, a treasure trove of objects and information about how the ancient Egyptians lived and died, among all the gold, among all the precious objects, among all the carefully placed items meant to accompany the king into the next world. There were jars, sealed jars containing ointments and perfumes. And when these jars were opened, when their contents were analyzed, there, among the myrrh and frankincense and other precious substances, were traces consistent with lavender. Think on that for a moment. Where, picture, if you will, the priests in that ancient time, 3,000 years ago, perhaps more. Picture them preparing the body of their young king. They have washed him with sacred water. They have removed those parts that would decay. They have dried the flesh with natron salt, a process that takes 40 days, and now they begin the anointing. They bring forth jars of precious ointments. These are not common substances. These are materials that have been gathered from across the known world, that have been prepared according to ancient formulas that carry within them the accumulated knowledge of generations of embalmers, and they apply these ointments to the preserved flesh, coating it, sealing it, perfuming it. Why lavender? Why include lavender in these sacred preparations? We must consider several reasons, and as we do, we shall see how lavender's practical properties and its symbolic meanings became intertwined in the ancient mind. First, there is preservation itself. The Egyptians understood, through long experience, that certain substances helped to preserve dead flesh, helped to prevent decay, helped to keep corruption at bay. We know now, though they did not, that many aromatic plants contain oils with antimicrobial properties, that they actively resist the growth of bacteria and fungi that cause decay. Lavender is among these plants. Its oils, which give it its characteristic scent, also provide a measure of protection against decomposition. The Egyptians did not know the word antimicrobial. They did not understand bacteria or the chemical mechanisms of preservation, but they observed that bodies treated with certain substances kept better than bodies not so treated. They noticed that lavender containing ointments seemed to help maintain the integrity of the flesh, and so they used it, trusted it, included it in their most important preparations. But preservation alone does not explain lavender's presence in these sacred rites. There is more to it than mere practicality. There is symbolism, meaning a dimension that transcends the physical. You see, the Egyptians believed that the journey to the afterlife required purity. The deceased must be pure to stand before the gods, to have their heart weighed against the feather of truth, to enter into eternal life. And what, as we have already discussed, was lavender associated with from its earliest use? Cleanliness, purity, the washing away of impurity. When the priests anointed the body with lavender containing preparations, they were not merely preserving flesh, they were purifying it. They were making it ritually clean, spiritually clean, fit for its sacred purpose. The scent of lavender, which in life had marked the clean from the unclean, the cared for from the neglected, now marked the boundary between mortal life and eternal existence. This is not a small thing, this symbolic dimension. In sacred rites, in religious practices, the physical and the spiritual are not separate. They are woven together. The ointment that preserves the flesh also purifies the soul. The scent that pleases the living also pleases the gods. Lavender served both purposes at once, and there is yet another aspect to consider. The Egyptians placed great importance on fragrance in their religious practices. They burned incense in their temples. They anointed their priests with perfumed oils. They believed that sweet scents were pleasing to the gods, that they facilitated communication between the human and divine realms, that they made sacred spaces more sacred. In the context of burial, fragrance served to mask the inevitable odors of death and decay, yes, but more than that, it transformed the atmosphere of the tomb from one of death into one of transition. The tomb was not merely a place where a body was stored, it was a doorway, a threshold, a place where the deceased passed from one form of existence to another, and that sacred space should smell not of death, but of the precious substances that marked it as holy. Lavender's fragrance, then, was part of creating the proper environment for this transition. When the tomb was sealed, when the final prayers were spoken, the air within was perfumed with lavender among other scents. This was the last gift of the living to the dead, an atmosphere of sweetness, of purity, of care. The priests who performed these rites knew their craft well. They knew which substances to use, and in what proportions. They knew the prayers to speak and the rituals to follow, and they knew that lavender belonged in these preparations, that it had a rightful place in the sacred work of preparing the dead for eternity. Now we might ask ourselves, how did the Egyptians obtain their lavender? Egypt itself is not the native home of this plant. It grows in the lands around the Mediterranean. Yes, but Egypt's climate is different, hotter, drier in a different way. The answer is trade, that ancient practice that has connected distant peoples since the beginning of civilization. The Egyptians traded far and wide. Their ships sailed the Mediterranean. Their caravans traveled overland to the east and south. They sought precious materials from wherever they could be found: cedarwood from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and yes, lavender from wherever it grew most abundantly. Perhaps from the lands we now call Syria or Lebanon, perhaps from islands in the Mediterranean, perhaps from multiple sources. The lavender that ended up in those burial ointments had traveled, had been harvested by foreign hands, had been transported by ship or camel or cart, had passed through markets and middlemen before finally reaching the workshops where the Egyptian embalmers prepared their sacred compounds. It was a precious commodity, valued not just for itself, but for the distance it had traveled, for the expense of obtaining it, for its exotic origins. To use lavender in burial rites, then, was also a statement of wealth and power. it said that this deceased person was important enough to merit ingredients from distant lands. It said that no expense had been spared in the preparation for eternal life. This was particularly true for pharaohs and nobles, of course. Common people were buried more simply, with fewer imported luxuries. But even in more modest burials, when the family could afford it, fragrant oils were used, and lavender may well have been among them. The tomb of Tutankhamun gives us our most complete picture, because it was found largely intact, unrobbed, preserved by fortunate circumstance. But it is not unique. Other royal tombs, other noble burials, have yielded similar evidence. The practice of using lavender in burial preparations was not a single instance, not an anomaly. It was part of a tradition, a practice that spanned centuries of Egyptian civilization. And what became of this knowledge, this practice? When Egyptian civilization waned, did the use of lavender in burial rites die with the pharaohs? Not entirely. The knowledge spread as knowledge does, through contact and conquest and trade. The Greeks learned from the Egyptians. The Romans learned from the Greeks. Each culture adapted the practices to their own beliefs, their own customs, but the fundamental understanding remained, that certain plants, lavender among them, had a proper place in the treatment of the dead. But I am moving too quickly through time. We shall come to the Greeks and Romans in due course. For now, let us remain in ancient Egypt a while longer. Let us consider more carefully what it meant to bridge, as you so aptly phrase it, the living and the eternal through fragrance. The Egyptians believed in many gods, gods who governed every aspect of life and death. There was Anubis, the jackal-headed god who oversaw embalming and mummification. There was Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who had himself died and been resurrected. There was Maat, the goddess of truth and order, whose feather was weighed against the heart of the deceased. These gods demanded proper treatment of the dead. They demanded ritual purity, careful preparation, respect. When the embalmers worked, they worked as much for the gods as for the deceased. They were performing a sacred duty, ensuring that the dead would be acceptable to the divine powers. And in this work, every element mattered. The prayers that were spoken, the amulets that were placed, the way the body was positioned, and yes, the ointments that were applied. Lavender, in this context, was not merely a pleasant scent or a preservative substance. It was an offering. It was part of the sacred technology, if we may call it that, by which human beings sought to ensure the safe passage of their dead into the eternal realm. It was both physical and spiritual, both practical and symbolic, both of this world and of the next. This dual nature of lavender, this ability to serve both earthly and heavenly purposes, is something we should keep in mind as we continue our explorations. Again and again, we shall find that lavender is valued not just for what it does in a purely material sense, but for what it represents, for what it signifies, for the meanings that human beings have invested in it across centuries and cultures. The ancient Egyptians, in their elaborate rituals of death and preservation, recognized something essential about lavender. They recognized that it belonged in the most sacred contexts, that it had a role to play in humanity's greatest mystery. They trusted it with their dead, with their kings, with their hopes for eternal life, and that trust was not misplaced. The bodies they so carefully prepared have lasted, in some cases, for more than 3,000 years. When we look upon the face of an Egyptian mummy in a museum, when we see the wrapped form lying in its painted coffin, we are looking at the end result of that sacred work. And somewhere in those ancient linens, absorbed into the preserved flesh, are traces of lavender, still present, still doing its work of preservation, still carrying its scent across millennia. This is the power of lavender in the ancient world. It was not a common herb, carelessly used. It was a bridge between worlds, a substance deemed worthy of the most important transitions, a participant in the sacred mysteries of death and eternal life. We shall rest here, I think, before moving on to speak of other ancient uses, other cultures, other ways in which lavender was understood and valued. But let us carry with us this understanding that from the earliest times we can trace, lavender was recognized as something special, something that belonged not just to daily life, but to the sacred realm, not just to the living, but to the eternal. Sit quietly for a moment. Think on those ancient priests, working by lamplight in their preparation rooms, carefully grinding and mixing their sacred ointments, speaking their prayers, attending to every detail of their holy work. And think on the lavender they used, harvested far away, brought at great expense, applied with reverence to the bodies of the dead. This is part of lavender's story, part of its long history with humankind, and we have only just begun. Not merely as a pleasant scent or a sacred substance, but as medicine. This transition from the spiritual to the medical may seem to us a great leap. We think of medicine and religion as separate domains, do we not? But the ancients made no such clean division. To them, healing was often a sacred act, and the substances used for healing were understood to have properties both physical and spiritual. So perhaps it is not so much that lavender moved from one realm to another, but rather that human understanding of lavender expanded, deepened, found new applications for this versatile plant. Let us turn our attention, then, to the Greeks and the Romans, those two great civilizations who built upon the knowledge of the Egyptians and added their own observations, their own theories, their own systematic approaches to understanding the world and the body. The Greeks were great thinkers, great systematizers. They did not merely notice that a plant had useful properties. They sought to understand why. They developed elaborate theories of health and illness, of humors and temperaments, of hot and cold, wet and dry. Everything in their medical system had its place, its nature, its proper use, and lavender, which they encountered in their travels and their conquests, found its place within this system. Now, here we must pause and address a matter of names, for it can cause confusion if we are not careful. The Greeks and Romans did not always call this plant lavender. Sometimes they called it by names that have come down to us as nard or spikenard. These terms are ancient, and their precise botanical reference have been debated by scholars for generations. Some of what the ancients called nard was indeed what we would recognize as lavender, particularly the spike lavender that grows wild in their lands. Other times, nard referred to different but related plants, or to preparations that mixed several aromatic substances together. The ancient writers were not always precise in their botanical descriptions, you see. They were more concerned with properties and uses than with the careful taxonomic distinctions that occupy the modern botanist. But we have good reason to believe that much of what they described as nard, particularly in the western Mediterranean regions, was in fact lavender. The descriptions match. The properties they attributed to it align with what we know of lavender. And so, when we read these ancient texts, when we find them speaking of nard used for healing, we can with reasonable confidence understand that they speak, at least in part, of our lavender. The Greek physicians, and later the Roman physicians who learned from them, wrote extensively about the medicinal uses of plants. They compiled great works, books that listed hundreds of substances and their applications. And in these works we find lavender described as useful for a variety of ailments. Headaches, for instance. The ancient doctors observed that lavender, taken internally or applied externally, seemed to ease the pain of headaches. Now, they did not understand, as we begin to, in our modern age, the mechanisms by which this might work. They did not speak of blood vessels or nerve impulses or chemical compounds, but they noticed the effect. A patient complaining of a headache might be given an infusion of lavender flowers to drink, or might have lavender oil rubbed upon the temples, and often enough to be remarked upon and remembered, the headache would lessen. This is how medical knowledge accumulated in the ancient world, you see. Through observation, through trial, through the careful noting of what seemed to work and what did not. If a remedy was tried 10 times and helped 8 times, it was considered effective. Not perfect, but reliable enough to recommend. And lavender, for headaches, proved itself often enough to be included in the medical texts, to be taught to apprentice physicians, to be kept in stock by those who prepared medicines. They also used lavender for complaints of the digestion. Indigestion, we call it, that uncomfortable feeling after eating, when the stomach seems unsettled, when there is bloating or pain, or a general sense of digestive distress. The ancient physicians would prepare lavender in various ways for this purpose, sometimes as a tea, made by steeping the dried flowers in hot water, sometimes as a tincture, the flowers soaked in wine or vinegar to extract their properties, sometimes mixed with honey to make it more palatable. The patient would be instructed to take a certain amount, perhaps a small cup of the infusion, perhaps a spoonful of the honey preparation, and again, often enough, the digestion would settle, the discomfort would ease. We might speculate with our modern knowledge that the aromatic oils in lavender have properties that relax the smooth muscles of the digestive tract, that reduce inflammation, that calm the nervous system which so influences digestion. But the ancients simply knew that it worked, or worked often enough to be worth trying. Sore throats, too, found relief in lavender. A gargle made with lavender-infused water, used several times a day, seemed to ease the pain and rawness of an inflamed throat. Perhaps the patient was suffering from what we now know as a bacterial infection, and the antimicrobial properties of lavender helped. Perhaps it was simply inflammation, and lavender's soothing qualities provided comfort. Perhaps, and this is not to be dismissed, the ritual of treatment itself, the care and attention paid to the illness, contributed to the patient's sense of improvement. Medicine is not only chemistry, after all. It is also care, attention, the sense that something is being done. The ancient physicians understood this, perhaps better than we do in our modern age. They understood that a remedy could work both through its physical properties and through the comfort it provided to the suffering person. But let us move now from the Greek physician in his consulting room to the Roman soldier on campaign. Here we find one of the most practical, most down-to-earth applications of lavender in the ancient world. The Roman legions, those disciplined forces that conquered most of the known world, carried lavender with them on their campaigns. Think for a moment about the life of a Roman soldier. He marched long distances, often through hostile territory. He fought battles with sword and spear, in close combat where injuries were common. He lived in camps, often in conditions that were far from clean, where wounds could easily become infected, where disease spread readily among men living in close quarters. The Roman military, like all successful military organizations, understood the importance of keeping soldiers healthy and functional. A wounded soldier who could be treated and returned to duty was far more valuable than one who died of infection or disease. And so the Roman army developed what we might call military medicine, practical measures to treat common ailments and injuries. And lavender was part of this military medicine. Roman soldiers, we are told, carried lavender with them, not great quantities, for everything a soldier carried had to be justified by its usefulness, but enough to treat wounds, to clean injuries, to attempt to prevent the corruption of flesh that so often followed battle. When a soldier was wounded, when sword or spear had opened his flesh, the wound would be cleaned. Water would be used first, if water was available, to wash away dirt and blood, but then Then lavender would be applied, perhaps as a poultice, the flowers crushed and placed directly on the wound, perhaps as a wash, lavender steeped in wine or water and used to bathe the injury, perhaps as an oil, if the soldier or his unit was well supplied enough to have lavender oil. The Romans believed, and not without reason, that lavender helped wounds to heal cleanly. They observed that wounds treated with lavender seemed less likely to fester, less likely to become hot and swollen and filled with pus, less likely to lead to the fevers that killed so many wounded men. In their terms, they might have said that lavender prevented corruption, that it kept the wound sweet, that it promoted healing. We would say now, with our modern understanding, that lavender has antiseptic properties. We know that it contains compounds that inhibit the growth of many types of bacteria. We understand the mechanism in a way the Romans did not, but the end result is the same. Wounds treated with lavender had a better chance of healing without infection. This was knowledge born of necessity, you see. The Roman army could not afford to lose men to infected wounds. They tried many remedies, many different substances, and they kept what worked. They were pragmatic, the Romans. Superstition had its place, certainly, but in matters of military efficiency, in matters of keeping soldiers alive and fighting, they wanted results, and lavender gave results. So lavender traveled with the legions, across Europe, to Britain in the far north, to Africa in the south, to the east as far as Mesopotamia. Wherever Roman soldiers went, they carried their military medicine with them, and lavender was part of that medicine. In this way, knowledge of lavender's healing properties spread far beyond its native Mediterranean home. Local peoples, conquered by Rome or allied with Rome, observed what the Roman soldiers used. They saw that the foreign plants the Romans valued seemed to help with wounds and sickness, and over time, some of these peoples adopted these remedies themselves, incorporating them into their own medical traditions. This is one way that medical knowledge has always spread, through contact between cultures, through observation and imitation and adaptation. But let us consider more carefully what this transition meant. This movement of lavender from temple and tomb into battlefield and body, as you so eloquently phrase it. In Egypt, lavender was associated with the sacred, with purity, with death and eternal life. In Greece and Rome, without entirely losing those associations, lavender became something more ordinary, more practical. It became a tool, a remedy, something to be used not just in extraordinary circumstances, but in the common challenges of human life. A headache is not a sacred matter. It is a mundane discomfort, annoying but not profound, yet lavender could address it. A sore throat is a minor ailment, hardly worth mentioning in the grand sweep of history, yet lavender could ease it. A soldier's wound, while more serious, is still a practical problem requiring a practical solution. Lavender could provide that solution. This is an important development in lavender's history. It marks the plant's full integration into human life, not as something rare and precious to be saved for special occasions, but as something useful and reliable for everyday needs. The Greeks and Romans, with their systematic approach to medicine, with their extensive writings on medical matters, ensured that knowledge of lavender's properties would be preserved and passed down. The great Roman physician Dioscorides, who traveled with the armies and wrote an extensive work on medicinal plants, described lavender and its uses. His book, the Materia Medica as it has come to be known, was copied and recopied for more than 1,000 years, well into the medieval period and beyond. When a medieval monk or physician wanted to know about medicinal plants, he would consult Dioscorides, and there he would find lavender, described and recommended for the same uses that the Romans had discovered. Similarly, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his vast natural history, mentioned lavender and its properties. Pliny was not a physician, but a compiler of knowledge, a man who sought to gather everything known about the natural world into one comprehensive work, and in that work, among the thousands of facts and observations about animals and plants and minerals, lavender has its place. These written works, these books that survived the fall of Rome and the chaos that followed, carried the knowledge of lavender's medical uses into the future. They ensured that what the Greeks and Romans had learned would not be lost, but would be available to later generations who sought to understand and use medicinal plants. But I am once again moving too quickly through time. Let us remain with the Romans a while longer. Let us think about what it meant, in practical terms, for a Roman soldier to carry lavender in his kit. He would have known, through training or through observation of older soldiers, that this small supply of dried flowers or this tiny flask of oil could make the difference between a wound that healed and a wound that killed. In the chaos of battle, in the exhaustion after fighting, when he or a comrade was bleeding, he would reach for the lavender among his supplies. His hands would be dirty, perhaps trembling with fatigue or shock, but he would do what he had been taught. Clean the wound as best he could, apply the lavender, bind it with whatever cloth was available, and hope that the wound would close cleanly, that fever would not follow, that in a few days or weeks the injury would be nothing more than a scar. How many soldiers, I wonder, owed their lives to lavender? How many wounds, that in earlier ages would have festered and killed, instead healed because of this plant? We cannot know the numbers, of course. The Romans did not keep such statistics, but we know that they continued to use lavender, that it remained part of their military medicine for centuries, and they would not have continued to use it if it had not proven its value time and time again. This, then, is how lavender crossed from the sacred to the medical, from the extraordinary to the ordinary, from ritual to remedy. It did so because people observed its effects, because they found it useful, because it worked, not perfectly, not every time, but often enough to earn its place in the medical kit, in the physician's collection of remedies, in the household store of useful substances. The Greeks, with their theories and their systematic thinking, gave lavender a place in medical philosophy. The Romans, with their pragmatism and their vast empire, spread that knowledge far and wide. Together, these two civilizations transformed lavender from an exotic substance used primarily in religious contexts into a familiar remedy used for common ailments. And yet, lavender never entirely lost its sacred associations, its connection to purity and cleanliness, its suggestion of something beyond the merely material. Even as it became common, it remained somehow special. Even as it became practical, it retained its poetry. This dual nature, both ordinary and extraordinary, both mundane and meaningful, is part of what has allowed lavender to remain valued across so many centuries and cultures. We shall pause here, I think. We have traveled from Egypt, through Greece and Rome, from sacred ointment to military medicine, from temple to battlefield. We have seen how human understanding of lavender expanded and deepened, how new uses were found without the old ones being forgotten. There is much more to say, of course. We have not yet spoken of how this knowledge was preserved and expanded in the medieval period, how the monasteries kept the traditions of herbal medicine alive, how new preparations and applications were developed. All that will come in time. But for now, let us rest with this understanding that by the end of the classical period, by the time Rome fell and the ancient world gave way to what would follow, lavender was firmly established as a medicinal plant with documented uses and proven effects. The foundation was laid, the knowledge was recorded, and it would be passed on through all the centuries to come to us who sit here tonight, turning over these old facts like treasured coins, examining them by candlelight, adding our own understanding to the great accumulation of human knowledge about this remarkable plant. Rest now. Let your mind settle. There is no hurry in this work of understanding. We proceed slowly, carefully, attending to each detail in its turn. Sweet air, in a dangerous world. We have spoken of lavender in individual healing, in the treatment of particular ailments and wounds. And now we must broaden our view. We must look at how lavender came to be used, not just for the sick person, but for the sick room, not just for the individual body, but for the air itself, for the very atmosphere that surrounds us. We must speak of fumigation, of purification, of the ancient and persistent belief that disease travels on bad air, and that sweet-smelling plants like lavender can protect against it. This is a more complex matter than it might first appear, and we must approach it carefully, for it involves beliefs that we now know to be mistaken, alongside practices that, perhaps for different reasons than were originally thought, had some genuine protective effect. It is the task of the historian, and of the honest apothecary, to untangle these threads without dismissing the people of the past as merely foolish or superstitious. Let us begin with the simple observation that where people gather, where they live in close quarters, where the sick are tended, the air becomes foul. This is something humans have always known. With the smell of sickness, the smell of crowded bodies, the smell of waste and decay, these are unpleasant, and it has always been felt, somehow unwholesome. The connection between bad smells and illness was observed long before anyone understood what caused disease. In the medieval period, and indeed continuing well into more recent centuries, there developed a theory of disease that explained this connection. It was called the miasma theory, from the Greek word for pollution or stain. The idea was that disease was caused by bad air, by miasmas, by invisible vapors that arose from rotting matter, from swamps, from the sick themselves. These miasmas, it was believed, could enter the body through the nose and mouth, could corrupt the humors, could bring on fever and plague and death. Now we know today that this theory was wrong in its specifics. Disease is caused not by bad air, but by tiny organisms, bacteria and viruses, things so small they cannot be seen without powerful instruments. The miasma theory confused correlation with causation. Places that smelled bad often were places where disease was present. But the smell itself was not the cause. Both the smell and the disease came from other factors: poor sanitation, crowding, contaminated water, the presence of disease causing organisms. But here is what is interesting, what we must not overlook. Many of the practices that arose from the miasma theory were actually helpful, even if the reasoning behind them was incorrect. The impulse to make air smell sweet, to cleanse spaces, to create distance between the sick and the healthy, these were sound instincts, even if the theory explaining them was flawed. And lavender played a significant role in these practices, because lavender was strongly scented, because it was associated with cleanliness and purity, because it was readily available and not overly expensive. It became one of the primary plants used to combat what people believed was disease-carrying air. Let me describe some of the ways this was done, and as I do, I ask you to imagine yourself in an earlier time, in a world where disease was common and terrifying, where epidemics could sweep through a town and kill half the population, where the causes of illness were mysterious and the treatments often ineffective. First, there was the burning of herbs. In a room where someone was sick, in a home where fever had taken hold, people would place dried lavender, along with other aromatic plants, on a hot surface or in a brazier, letting the smoke rise and fill the air. This was called fumigation, and it served multiple purposes. The smoke, it was believed, would drive out the bad air, the miasmas that carried disease. The strong scent would mask the smell of sickness. And the act itself, the ritual of fumigation, gave people a sense that they were doing something, that they were not helpless before the disease. Can you picture it? Can you picture a darkened room, shutters closed against what was thought to be the dangerous outside air, a sick person lying on a bed, fevered, perhaps delirious, family members, frightened but dutiful, tending to the patient, and in a corner, a brazier glowing with coals, and upon it, sprigs of lavender beginning to smoulder, releasing their pungent smoke into the stale air of the sick room. Did this help? Well, the smoke would not cure the disease, certainly. If the patient had plague or typhus or any of the other deadly fevers that haunted our ancestors, lavender smoke alone would not save them. But the practice was not entirely without value. The aromatic smoke would indeed mask unpleasant odors, making the atmosphere of the sick room more bearable for those who had to remain there. And there is some evidence, though I speak cautiously here, that some aromatic smoke may have had mild antimicrobial effects or may have discouraged insects that could carry disease. But beyond any physical effect, there was the psychological value. The people tending the sick needed to feel that they had some power over the situation, some means of protection, some way to fight back against the invisible enemy of disease. Fumigation provided that sense of agency, that feeling of doing something rather than simply waiting in fear. Another common practice was the scattering of herbs on floors. In homes, in churches, in public buildings, fresh or dried herbs, including lavender, would be strewn across the floor. As people walked over them, the herbs would be crushed underfoot, releasing their scent into the air. This served to freshen the atmosphere of the room, to combat the odors of daily life in a time before modern sanitation. Now you must understand that in earlier centuries, floors were often just packed earth or rough wood, and cleanliness as we understand it today was difficult to achieve. Food scraps might fall and not be immediately cleaned. Rushes or straw were often spread on floors and left for extended periods. Animals might come in and out of homes. The result was that indoor air could be quite foul, particularly in winter, when doors and windows were kept closed against the cold. Scattering herbs on the floor was a practical response to this problem. Lavender, with its strong, clean scent, was particularly valued for this purpose. In great houses, in castles and manors, this was a regular practice, and there were servants whose job included the gathering and scattering of strewing herbs. In more modest homes, the practice was less regular, but still employed when possible, particularly during times of sickness or when guests were expected. And again, while this did not prevent disease in the way people thought it did improve living conditions. A pleasant-smelling home is, all else being equal, more healthful than a foul-smelling one, not because the scent itself prevents disease, but because the practices that lead to pleasant scents, cleanliness, ventilation, the removal of waste, do indeed promote health. During times of epidemic, during the great plagues that periodically devastated Europe, the use of aromatic herbs intensified. People became desperate for any protection, any hope, and the prevailing medical theory told them that strong scents could ward off disease, so they turned to the most aromatic plants they knew: lavender, rosemary, rue, wormwood, and others. They made what were called posies, or mussies, small bouquets of strongly scented herbs and flowers. These would be carried in the hand or pinned to clothing, held up to the nose when passing through areas thought to be dangerous, near the sick, near cesspools, near anywhere that smelled bad. The famous children's rhyme, "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies," is thought by some scholars to refer to this practice during plague times, though the interpretation is debated. The idea was that if you kept sweet-smelling herbs near your nose, breathing their scent instead of the supposedly disease-laden air, you would be protected. Physicians, visiting plague patients, would carry elaborate posies, or would stuff the beaks of their plague doctor masks with aromatic substances including lavender. Did these posies protect the doctors? not in the way they thought. The masks, with their long beaks, did create some distance between the doctor's face and the patient, which might have reduced exposure to droplets from coughing. But the lavender and other aromatics in the beak did not filter out disease or neutralize bad air. Still, the doctors who used these precautions, however incorrectly understood, at least felt they had some protection, which allowed them to continue their work of tending the sick. People also made sachets, small cloth bags filled with dried lavender and other herbs. These would be worn around the neck, hung from belts, tucked into pockets or bodices. The constant scent was thought to create a protective sphere of good air around the person. Again, this did not work as believed, but the practice was nearly universal during epidemic times. To go abroad without some aromatic protection was considered foolhardy. In public spaces, in churches especially, fumigation with lavender and other herbs was performed regularly during plague times. The church was where people gathered, where they breathed the same air, where, we now understand, disease could spread easily. The medieval church authorities did not understand contagion as we do, but they understood that disease seemed to spread among gathered people, and they sought to protect their congregations through fumigation. Great censers would be swung, burning not just the usual incense but also added herbs like lavender. The smoke would billow through the church, and the congregation would breathe it in, believing themselves protected by the sweet smoke against the dangerous air that might carry plague. There is something almost touching about these practices, is there not? The earnest belief that a plant's scent could ward off death, the careful preparation of posies and sachets, the systematic fumigation of homes and churches. These were not the actions of ignorant people, but of people doing the best they could with the understanding they had. They observed that disease and foul air seemed to go together. They reasoned that sweet air might therefore protect against disease, and they acted on that reasoning using the aromatic plants available to them. And lavender, because it was relatively common, because it was strongly scented, because it was already associated with cleanliness and purity, became one of the primary plants used in these protective rituals. It became, in a sense, armor against an invisible enemy, not effective armor, not as it was understood, but armor nonetheless, a way of fighting back against the terror of epidemic disease. Now, I spoke earlier of the line between medicine and charm, and we must address this, for it is important to understanding how lavender was used during these dangerous times. Was carrying a posy medicine, or was it a charm, a magical thinking? The answer is that it was both, and neither. The distinction between medicine and magic was not as clear in earlier centuries as we might like to think. Learned physicians might speak of humours and miasmas using the language of natural philosophy. Common people might speak of spirits and protection, using the language of folk belief, but both were trying to accomplish the same thing, to prevent disease, to protect themselves and their families. The physician with his expensive aromatics in his plague mask, and the peasant with her handful of lavender tucked in her bodice were engaged in fundamentally the same practice, operating on the same mistaken but understandable theory. And we must remember that medicine, at that time, was not yet a purely rational enterprise. There was no sharp divide between physical and spiritual causes of disease. Illness might be sent by God as punishment, or it might arise from bad air, or it might be caused by an imbalance of humours. Treatment, therefore, might include prayer, fumigation, bloodletting, herbal remedies, amulets, all used together without any sense of contradiction. Lavender participated in all of these approaches. It was a medical remedy prescribed by physicians. It was a protective charm carried by fearful populations. It was part of religious fumigation in churches. Pas, olve. It was a practical measure to improve bad-smelling air. It was all of these things at once, and the people who used it did not feel the need to choose one explanation over another. This is something we have lost, perhaps, in our modern age. We want clear categories. This is medicine, this is superstition, this works, this does not. But life, particularly in earlier times, was not so neatly organized. People used what seemed to help, what tradition recommended, what gave them comfort and hope, and if lavender could not actually prevent plague, well, it still made the air sweeter, still provided some comfort, still gave people a sense that they were not entirely powerless. The truth is that epidemic disease was eventually controlled not through aromatic herbs, but through improvements in sanitation, through the development of vaccines, through the discovery of antibiotics, through understanding of how disease actually spreads. But those developments came much later. For centuries, for the vast majority of human history, people had only their observations and their theories, imperfect as they were, and the aromatic plants like lavender that they hoped would protect them. And so lavender burned in sick rooms, was scattered on floors, was carried in posies and sachets, was hung in bundles from rafters, was stuffed into masks and censers. It became part of the apparatus of protection against disease, part of the daily and seasonal rhythms of trying to stay healthy in a dangerous world. We who live in an age of antibiotics and vaccines, who have seen deadly diseases like smallpox eradicated, who can treat bacterial infections with a few pills, we may smile at these old practices. We may think how quaint, how ineffective, how superstitious, but before we judge too harshly, let us remember that our ancestors were doing the best they could with what they knew. They were fighting against invisible enemies with the only weapons they had, and lavender, sweet-scented lavender, was one of those weapons. Did it work? Not as they thought, but it was not useless. It made sick rooms more bearable. It gave comfort and hope. It was part of a set of practices, including cleanliness and attention to the environment, that, whatever the faulty reasoning behind them, did contribute something to public health. And so we must judge these practices kindly, with understanding. They were born of fear, yes, but also of love, of the desire to protect family and community. They were born of observation, of the genuine connection between foul air and disease, even if the mechanism was misunderstood. They were born of hope, of the belief that humans were not entirely helpless before disease, that we could do something, even if that something was to fill the air with lavender smoke and pray. Let us pause here, then, in this difficult chapter of lavender's history. We have seen it move from individual medicine to public health practice, from the physician's treatment to the common person's protection. We have seen how deeply lavender became woven into the fabric of daily life during times of epidemic fear, how it served both practical and symbolic purposes, how it stood at the intersection of medicine, magic, and simple human hope. There is more to say, always more. But for now, let this understanding settle. Think on those frightened people, clutching their posies, breathing in lavender's scent, hoping it would keep death at bay. They were our ancestors, doing what they could, with what they had, in a world far more dangerous and uncertain than the one we inhabit today. And lavender was with them, in their fear and in their hope, doing what it could, being what it was, a plant with a powerful scent, a long history, and a place in human hearts that went far beyond any purely physical property. Rest now. We have traveled through dangerous times together, through plague and fear and fumigation. The story continues, but we need not rush to it. Let these old sorrows and old hopes settle in your mind. There will be time enough for all the rest. The cloistered garden, we have spoken of chaos and fear, of epidemic times when people grasped at any protection they could find. Now let us turn to a quieter place, a more ordered place. Let us step through the gates of a medieval monastery into those enclosed communities where, while the world outside often descended into violence and confusion, knowledge was carefully preserved, plants were methodically cultivated, and the old learning was kept alive through centuries of change. This is a chapter in Lavender's history that I hold particularly dear, perhaps because I see in those monastic gardens something of what I have tried to maintain in my own work all these years: a dedication to careful observation, to the systematic recording of knowledge, to the patient cultivation of useful plants. The monasteries were, in many ways, the guardians of botanical and medical knowledge through what we call the medieval period, those long centuries between the fall of Rome and the dawn of our modern age. Let me paint you a picture, if I may, of a typical monastery in, shall we say, the 12th or 13th century. Somewhere in Europe, perhaps in France or Germany or England or Italy. The location matters less than the pattern, for monasteries across Christendom followed similar rules, maintained similar practices, valued similar things. The monastery is enclosed by walls, separating the sacred space within from the secular world without. Inside those walls, there are various buildings. The church, of course, where the monks gather for prayer throughout the day and night, the dormitory where they sleep, the refectory where they take their simple meals, the chapter house where they meet, the scriptorium where they copy manuscripts, and, importantly for our purposes, the infirmary where sick monks are tended, and next to it, the physic garden where medicinal plants are grown. The physic garden, you see, was not a luxury or an afterthought. It was an essential part of the monastery's function. Monasteries were largely self-sufficient communities. They grew their own food, brewed their own ale, made their own bread, and they also grew their own medicines. When a monk fell ill, when a traveler seeking shelter arrived in poor health, when someone from the surrounding village came to the monastery gates asking for help, as they often did, the infirmary monk would turn to the physic garden for his remedies. And in that physic garden, carefully tended, reliably present, was lavender. It was considered one of the standard herbs, one of those plants that any well-ordered monastery would cultivate, not an exotic rarity, but a staple, a fundamental part of the medicinal repertoire. The gardens themselves were laid out with great care. The monks, you must understand, were not merely gardeners but students of plants. Many monasteries had at least one monk who specialized in the cultivation of herbs, who knew each plant's needs, who understood the proper times for planting and harvesting, who could identify plants and prepare them for use. This was serious work, important work, work that required knowledge and attention. The beds were often arranged in neat squares or rectangles, sometimes raised above the surrounding ground for better drainage. Paths between the beds allowed access for planting, weeding, and harvesting. Each plant had its place, chosen with thought for its requirements. Lavender, being a plant that prefers sun and does not want too much water, would be placed accordingly. Often, lavender was planted near the infirmary itself, within easy reach. When the infirmarian needed lavender for a remedy, he could step out and gather fresh stems or reach into his store of dried lavender put by from the previous summer's harvest. The proximity was intentional. The most frequently used plants were kept closest to hand, and make no mistake, lavender was frequently used. The monks were not inventing new applications for lavender, but maintaining the old ones, the uses that had been described by the ancient authorities whose works they so carefully copied and preserved. But let us speak of that copying, that preservation, for it is central to understanding the monastery's role in keeping botanical knowledge alive. You see, when Rome fell, when the Western Empire collapsed into what we sometimes call the Dark Ages, much knowledge was lost, libraries were destroyed, schools closed, the infrastructure that had supported learning and scholarship largely disappeared, but not entirely. The monasteries, with their dedication to learning, with their scriptoria, where manuscripts were painstakingly copied by hand, became repositories of ancient knowledge. When a monastery possessed a valuable text, monks would copy it, creating new versions that could be sent to other monasteries or kept as backup should the original be damaged or destroyed. And among the texts that were copied were medical works, the writings of Dioscorides, that Greek physician who had traveled with the Roman army and catalogued hundreds of medicinal plants, the works of Galen, the great Roman physician whose theories dominated medical thinking for more than 1,000 years, the texts of Pliny with his vast compilation of natural history. All of these mentioned lavender, described its properties, recommended its uses. So a monk in the scriptorium, sitting at his desk, his hand cramping from holding the quill, his eyes strained from reading the faded text of an ancient manuscript, would carefully copy the words about lavender. He would form each letter with precision, ensuring that the knowledge would be preserved, and when he was done, when the copy was complete, that knowledge would be safe for another generation. At the same time, out in the physic garden, another monk was actually growing the plants described in those ancient texts. He was putting theory into practice, learning through direct experience what lavender required to flourish, how it should be harvested, how it could be prepared and used. The knowledge was not merely textual but practical, not merely preserved but actively employed. This combination, this marriage of book learning and practical experience, is what made the monasteries such effective guardians of botanical knowledge. They did not merely copy old texts, they tested what those texts said. They grew the plants, they prepared the remedies, they used them to treat actual illnesses, and if something in the old texts seemed to be incorrect, if their experience suggested a different approach, they would make note of it, adding their own observations to the accumulated knowledge. The uses of lavender that the monks maintained were those we have already discussed: for digestive complaints, for headaches, for calming the nerves, for treating wounds. A monk suffering from indigestion after the heavy bean porridge that was often the monastery fare might be given a cup of lavender tea by the infirmarian. A monk who had injured himself while working in the fields might have his wound washed with lavender infused water. A monk who could not sleep, whose mind was troubled, might be given a pillow stuffed with lavender to ease his rest. These were not dramatic interventions. The monasteries were not performing surgery or treating advanced diseases with any great success, but for the common ailments of daily life, the minor complaints that nonetheless made life uncomfortable, the monks' herbal remedies, including lavender, provided real relief, and it was not only the monks themselves who benefited. Monasteries had a tradition of charity, of tending to the poor and sick who came to their gates. Part of this charity involved providing medical care. Such as it was, the infirmarian would treat anyone who came seeking help, drawing on his store of herbal remedies, using the plants from the physic garden. In this way, the knowledge preserved in the monasteries spread to the surrounding communities. A villager who received lavender tea for stomach complaints at the monastery might remember it, might seek out lavender to grow in their own garden. A traveling merchant who was treated for a wound with lavender wash might carry that knowledge to the next town. The monasteries were not isolated islands, but points of connection, places where knowledge was both preserved and shared. The monks also wrote new works, herbals they are called, books that described plants and their uses. These herbals drew on the ancient authorities, but also included the monks' own observations and the folk knowledge of the regions where they lived. And in these herbals, lavender invariably appeared, described in detail, its virtues enumerated, its cultivation explained. One of the most famous of these medieval herbals was written by a remarkable woman, Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess of the 12th century. Hildegard was a mystic, a composer, a writer, and among her many works was a book on medicine and natural history. She wrote of lavender, which she called by one of its medieval Latin names, and she recommended it for maintaining purity of character and cleanliness of mind, as well as for its physical healing properties. This blending of the physical and spiritual, the medical and the moral, was typical of medieval thinking. Lavender was good for the body and good for the soul. It helped digestion, and it helped maintain a pure heart. There was no contradiction seen in this. Health was understood holistically as a state of the whole person, not just the physical body. The monasteries also maintained lavender for practical purposes beyond medicine. They used it in their housekeeping, scattering it on floors as we discussed earlier. They used it in the preparation of their dead, continuing that ancient tradition of associating lavender with funeral rites. They used it to scent the linens in the infirmary, making the space more pleasant for the sick. In some monasteries, particularly those in regions where lavender grew abundantly, monks might cultivate large quantities of it, not just for their own use but for trade. Dried lavender could be sold, providing income for the monastery. Lavender oil, if they had the skill and equipment to distill it, was even more valuable. In this way, lavender became part of the monastery's economic as well as medical life. The rhythm of the monastic year included the rhythm of the lavender. In spring, the plants would be tended, weeds removed, dead wood trimmed away. In summer, usually in July, when the flowers were at their peak, the harvest would take place. This was careful work. But as say, the stems were cut at the right length, tied in bundles, hung to dry in a well-ventilated space away from direct sunlight. The dried lavender would then be stored, some to be used fresh for strewing, some to be kept for winter use when fresh herbs were not available. The monk in charge of the physic garden would know his lavender plants individually, would notice if one was struggling, would know which plants produced the most flowers, which had the strongest scent. This was not abstract knowledge, but intimate familiarity, the kind that comes only from daily attention over years. And this knowledge, this practical expertise in cultivation, was passed down from older monks to younger ones. A novice entering the monastery might be assigned to work in the physic garden under the supervision of an experienced brother. He would learn through doing, through the actual work of planting and weeding and harvesting. He would learn when to water and when to withhold water, how to recognize disease in plants, how to encourage strong growth. This apprenticeship model, this direct transmission of practical knowledge from master to student, was how the expertise was maintained. It was not enough to read about lavender in a book. One had to actually grow it, had to learn through one's hands and one's observations. The monastery provided the stable environment where this learning could take place unhurried, where a monk might spend decades working with the same plants in the same garden, accumulating deep knowledge. Consider for a moment what the world outside the monastery was like during these centuries. There were wars, of course, almost constant warfare between various kingdoms and lords. There were famines when harvests failed. There were plagues and epidemics sweeping through populations. There was political instability, with boundaries shifting, governments rising and falling. For the common people, life was often hard, uncertain, dangerous. But inside the monastery walls, there was order. There was routine, the same prayers at the same hours every day, the same meals, the same work, following the same pattern year after year. And in the physic garden, the same plants growing in the same beds, tended in the same way, providing the same remedies for the same ailments. This stability, this preservation of knowledge and practice through centuries of external chaos was no small achievement. The monasteries kept alive, not just the written knowledge of the ancients, but the living practice of herbal medicine. They maintained the gardens, grew the plants, prepared the remedies, treated the sick, and in doing so, they ensured that knowledge of lavender and hundreds of other medicinal plants would not be lost. When eventually the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, when learning began to flourish again outside the monastery walls, when universities were founded and physicians trained in new ways, the knowledge the monasteries had preserved became available to this wider world. The herbals, written by monks, were printed and distributed. The plants cultivated in monastery gardens were studied by the new generation of botanists. The remedies used in monastery infirmaries became part of the general medical practice. But all of this later flowering was made possible by the patient, unglamorous work of preservation that the monasteries had undertaken, generation after generation of monks, most of whom we do not know by name, who left no great works behind, who simply did their duty in tending gardens and copying manuscripts and treating the sick. These humble workers kept the knowledge alive, and lavender was part of that knowledge. Not the most dramatic plant, not the most exotic or expensive, but a reliable presence, a standard remedy, a plant that could be counted on. The monks knew this. They planted it, harvested it, used it, year after year, century after century. When I stand in my own garden, when I tend my own lavender plants, I feel a kinship with those long ago monks. They too stood in their gardens on summer mornings, considering the plants, making decisions about when to harvest, how to prune. They too cut the flowering stems and hung them to dry, releasing that distinctive scent into the air. They too ground the dried flowers in mortars, prepared infusions, dispensed remedies to those in need. The line connecting us is long, but unbroken. The knowledge they preserved, we still use. The plants they cultivated, we still grow. The remedies they trusted, we still employ, though now perhaps with better understanding of why they work. This is the gift of the monasteries to us. Continuity, preservation, the faithful maintenance of knowledge through difficult times. When we use lavender today, we are benefiting from the work of those medieval monks who ensured that the plant and the knowledge of its uses would not be lost to time. Let us pause here, in this cloistered garden, in this peaceful space where knowledge was kept safe. Let us rest our minds with the thought of those orderly beds, those carefully tended plants, those monks going about their work with patience and devotion. There is something deeply restful about contemplating such stability, such dedication to a task that extends far beyond one's own lifetime. The story continues, of course. Lavender's journey through history does not end in the monastery garden, but it passes through that garden, and it is enriched by the time spent there, preserved and protected and passed on with care. Rest now in this knowledge. There is no rush. We have time enough to continue, but for now, let the image of that medieval garden settle in your mind. The neat beds, the purple flowers, the monks at their work, the old knowledge kept alive through patient tending. All is well, all is in order. Rest. Lavender in Daily Monastic Life. We have spoken of the monastery's role in preserving knowledge, in maintaining the written texts and the practical cultivation of medicinal plants. But now let us step closer. Let us peer into the daily life of these communities, into the actual ways that lavender was used from dawn to dusk, from season to season. For it is one thing to speak of knowledge in the abstract, and quite another to understand how that knowledge manifested in the lived reality of medieval monks. Let me take you through a day, or rather, let me describe various moments across the days and seasons, moments when lavender would have played its quiet part in the rhythm of monastic life. We shall begin in the infirmary, for that is where lavender's medicinal properties were most directly employed. Picture the infirmarian, the monk responsible for tending to the sick. He rises early, as all monks do, for the first prayers of the day. But after prayers, while other monks go to their various tasks, he makes his way to the infirmary to check on any brothers who are ill or recovering from illness. Perhaps there is a monk with a fever, lying on a simple bed, covered with a rough blanket. Perhaps another who has injured himself in a fall, or who suffers from the aching joints that come with age and the damp stone buildings. The infirmarian has his remedies prepared, some made fresh each day, others kept in store. In the corner of the infirmary room there is a table with various vessels, ceramic pots, glass bottles if the monastery is wealthy enough, wooden containers. Each is labeled or known by position, for the infirmarian knows his supplies, as well as a soldier knows his weapons. For the monk with fever and digestive upset, perhaps a result of some spoiled food, or simply the weakness that comes with illness, the infirmarian prepares a lavender infusion. He takes a measure of dried lavender flowers from his store, places them in a cup, pours over them hot water that has been heated in the infirmary's small brazier. He lets it steep, watching as the water takes on a slight golden color as the familiar scent rises with the steam. While it steeps, he might add a spoonful of honey, both to sweeten the bitter taste, and because honey itself is considered healthful. When it has cooled enough to drink, he brings it to the fevered monk, helps him to sit up if necessary, steadies the cup as he drinks. The warm liquid soothes the throat, settles the stomach. It will not cure the fever, but it brings some comfort, some ease, and comfort is not nothing. Comfort is part of healing. For the monk with the injury, there is a different preparation. The infirmarian has made a lavender wash, steeping a larger quantity of lavender in water, then straining it and keeping it in a sealed bottle. He pours some of this wash onto a clean cloth. The monastery has a supply of linen cloth, kept specifically for medical purposes, washed and re-washed until they are soft and clean. He uses this lavender-soaked cloth to gently clean the wound, washing away any dirt or dried blood, examining the injury to ensure it is healing properly. If the wound seems inflamed, if there is redness or heat, suggesting the beginning of infection, he might apply a lavender salve. This he has prepared earlier, during the late summer, when lavender was abundant. He took fresh lavender flowers and infused them in olive oil if the monastery could afford it, or rendered fat from animals if not. The flowers steeped in the warm oil for days, transferring their properties into the oil, which was then strained and sometimes thickened with beeswax to make a salve that could be spread on wounds. He applies this salve gently, then binds the wound again with clean cloth. He will check it again tomorrow and the day after, watching for signs of healing or signs of trouble. This is the infirmarian's work: constant vigilance, regular tending, the application of simple remedies made from the plants in the garden. For the elderly monk with aching joints, there might be a lavender liniment, the oil rubbed into the painful areas, the warmth of the rubbing, and the properties of the lavender combining to bring some relief. For the monk who cannot sleep, who lies awake at night, despite the exhausting round of prayers and work, there might be a pillow stuffed with dried lavender, the scent of it close to his face as he tries to rest. For the monk suffering from nervous complaints, from what we might now call anxiety, from the heavy burden of melancholy that sometimes afflicts those who live in isolated communities and contemplate constantly their sins and salvation, there might be lavender wine. The infirmarian has prepared this by steeping lavender flowers in wine for several days. In straining it, a small cup of this, taken before bed, helps to calm the agitated mind, to ease the troubled spirit. Now let us move from the infirmary to other parts of the monastery, for lavender's usefulness extended far beyond medical applications. In the dormitory, where the monks sleep on their simple beds, lavender plays a role in maintaining cleanliness and freshness. The monastery has bedding, of course, though far simpler than what wealthy people might enjoy. Straw mattresses, woolen blankets, linen sheets if the monastery is prosperous. These items must be kept clean, but washing such large items is difficult and time-consuming. Water must be heated, the bedding scrubbed, then dried, which in the damp climate of much of northern Europe is no simple matter. So the monks use other methods to keep the bedding fresh between washings. Dried lavender is scattered among the straw of the mattresses when they are restuffed. The scent permeates the straw, makes it pleasant to lie upon, and the properties of lavender help to discourage the insects that might otherwise infest the bedding. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, these are constant problems in an age before modern sanitation. Lavender does not eliminate them entirely, but it helps to reduce their numbers, makes them less inclined to settle in the bedding. When the linen sheets are washed and dried, they are often laid in chests with sachets of dried lavender between the layers. This keeps them smelling fresh, protects them from moths that might otherwise damage the fabric, and ensures that when a monk lies down to sleep, he is surrounded by that clean, calming scent. Think on that for a moment. The monk has been awake since before dawn. He has attended multiple prayer services, each lasting an hour or more. He has worked in the fields, perhaps, or in the scriptorium, or at whatever task has been assigned to him. He has eaten simple meals of bread and vegetables and perhaps a little fish. He has maintained silence for much of the day, keeping his thoughts focused on God and duty. Now, at last, as darkness falls, he goes to his bed in the dormitory. He lies down on the mattress, stuffed with lavender-scented straw. He pulls over himself a blanket that has been stored with lavender, that carries that familiar scent. His head rests on a pillow that may also contain lavender. And as he begins to drift toward sleep, despite the hardness of the bed and the cold of the stone building, there is this small comfort, the scent of lavender, clean and calming, surrounding him, easing him into rest. This is not a small thing. The monastic life was hard. The discipline was strict. The comforts were few. But those few comforts that existed were carefully maintained, and lavender contributed to them. Let us move now to the storage areas, where the monastery keeps its textiles. Every monastery has a supply of cloth, the habits that the monks wear, spare robes kept for when the current ones wear out, altar cloths for the church, towels and linens for various uses. These are valuable items, representing considerable expense and labor. The cloth itself must be purchased or made, the garments sewn, the linens hemmed, and these textiles must be protected. Moths are a serious problem. A chest of stored clothing left unprotected can be devastated by moths in a single season, the larvae eating holes through the fabric, rendering it useless. So the monk, in charge of the monastery's textiles, takes precautions. Among those precautions is lavender. Dried lavender is placed in the storage chests, often in small linen bags, so the loose flowers don't scatter through the clothing. The strong scent of lavender is unpleasant to moths, discourages them from laying their eggs in the stored fabric. It is not perfect protection. Nothing in that age was perfect, but it helps. It significantly reduces the damage from moths, extends the life of the valuable textiles. This same monk might also use lavender when preparing new habits for novices entering the monastery, or when cleaning and refreshing the altar cloths used in the church. The connection between lavender and cleanliness, between lavender and the sacred, makes it particularly appropriate for items used in religious ceremonies. In the common rooms, in the refectory where meals are taken, in the chapter house where the monks gather for meetings, lavender appears in yet another form. Remember that these are buildings with stone floors, with limited ventilation, where many men live in close quarters. The air can become stale, the smell of humanity concentrated. So, following the old practice we discussed earlier, dried lavender and other herbs are scattered on the floors, As the monks walk across these floors, going about their daily business, their feet crush the dried herbs, releasing the scent into the air. This makes the indoor spaces more pleasant, more bearable, particularly in winter when doors and windows must be kept closed against the cold. Whiteacia. The old crushed herbs are swept up and new ones scattered down. Think of the monk whose task it is to maintain these spaces. He goes to the storage area where dried herbs are kept, fills a basket with lavender, and perhaps rosemary and other aromatic plants. He walks through the monastery, scattering handfuls across the floors, the familiar scent rising as the herbs fall. It is humble work, unglamorous work, but necessary work, and it is work that connects him to the garden, to the harvest, to the cycle of seasons, to the practical usefulness of the plants that grow within the monastery walls. Now, let us speak of something more subtle, something less tangible but no less real, the way that lavender's fragrance aligned with the monastery's spiritual purposes. The monastic life was dedicated to purity, to the pursuit of holiness, to the disciplining of the body and the elevation of the spirit. Everything in the monastery was ideally ordered toward these ends, and scent, fragrance, the very quality of the air one breathed, was understood to have spiritual significance. Bad smells were associated with sin and corruption. Sweet smells were associated with virtue and holiness. The saints, it was said, sometimes gave off a sweet scent, an odor of sanctity. The incense burned in church carried prayers upward to heaven. In this context, lavender was more than just a practical cleaning agent. Fidely aligned with the monastic ideals. A space scented with lavender was a space that spoke of order, of cleanliness, of proper discipline. A monk surrounded by the scent of lavender was, in a small way, surrounded by a sensory reminder of what he was striving for: purity of heart, calmness of mind, freedom from the chaos and corruption of the world. This is why lavender was particularly used in the church itself, in the most sacred space of the monastery. On feast days, on important occasions, fresh lavender might be strewn in the church. The altar linens might be specially washed with lavender water. The priest's vestments might be stored with lavender, so they carried that scent during the celebration of the Mass. The connection was not explicitly stated, perhaps. The monks did not necessarily write in their texts that lavender equals purity equals holiness, but the association was there, felt, understood at a level deeper than explicit doctrine. When a monk smelled lavender, it evoked cleanliness, calmness, order, rightness. It helped create the atmosphere in which contemplation and prayer could flourish. Consider the monk spending hours in the scriptorium, painstakingly copying a manuscript. The work requires enormous concentration, steady hands, patience. The scriptorium must be quiet, orderly, conducive to this focused work. And if the scriptorium is kept clean, if the air is freshened with lavender, if even the desk where the monk works has been wiped with lavender water, all of this contributes to creating the right atmosphere for the work. Or consider the monk in his cell, engaged in private prayer and meditation. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, prescribed hours of such private devotion. The monk kneels, he prays, he examines his conscience, he seeks communion with God, and if his small cell, with its simple bed and single chair and crucifix on the wall, smells of lavender, if his pillow carries that scent, if even his hands, washed with lavender water, carry a trace of that fragrance, then the scent becomes part of the prayer, part of the atmosphere of devotion. This is the deeper function of lavender in monastic life. It served the body, yes, treating ailments, protecting textiles, freshening spaces, but it also served the spirit, creating an environment that supported the monk's fundamental purpose, the pursuit of holiness, the ordering of life toward God, and perhaps this dual function, this service to both body and spirit, is why lavender was so thoroughly integrated into monastery life. It was not merely useful, it was appropriate, fitting, right. It belonged in the monastery as essentially as prayer itself belonged there. It was part of how the monastery functioned, part of what made it a place set apart from the world, a place dedicated to a higher purpose. The monk rising in the cold dawn to attend matins, the first prayer service of the day, might warm himself with a cup of lavender tea. The monk working all day in the fields, returning exhausted at evening, might wash his face and hands with lavender water before entering the church for vespers. The monk suffering from illness might find relief in lavender remedies. The monk struggling with troubled thoughts might find some ease in the scent of lavender on his pillow. From dawn to dusk, from season to season, from entrance to the monastery, as a young novice to death and burial, as an old monk, lavender was there. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, as thoroughly as prayer was woven into the hours of the day. It was ordinary and extraordinary, practical and symbolic, physical and spiritual, all at once. And the monks, in their methodical way, recorded all of this. They wrote of lavender's uses in their herbals. They copied the ancient texts that described its properties. They taught new generations of monks how to grow it, harvest it, prepare it, use it. They ensured that the knowledge would continue, that the practices would not be forgotten. When we use lavender today, when we make our teas and our salves and our sachets, we are continuing practices that have been maintained for more than 1,000 years. The monastery gardens are mostly gone now, or changed beyond recognition. The monks who tended them are long dead, their names forgotten. But the knowledge they kept, the practices they maintained, these survive. And when we smell lavender, that clean, calming scent, we are smelling something that those medieval monks knew, that the Romans before them knew, that the Egyptians before them knew. We are connected through this scent, through this plant, to a chain of human experience that stretches back thousands of years. This is what makes the study of lavender so rich, so meaningful. It is not merely botany or chemistry or medical history, it is human history. It is the story of how humans have tried to make their lives more bearable, more pleasant, more healthy. It is the story of how knowledge has been accumulated and preserved and passed down. It is the story of the connection between the physical and the spiritual, between the body and the soul. Let us rest here, in this monastery, in these daily routines made sacred by repetition and intention. Let us sit quietly and think of all the monks over all the centuries who have walked through lavender-scented spaces, who have been comforted by its fragrance, who have benefited from its properties. They are with us still, in a way, those patient gardeners and careful herbalists and devoted caretakers. Their work continues in ours. Their knowledge lives on in what we know. Their lavender, carefully cultivated and faithfully used, is the ancestor of the lavender we know today. Rest now. Let the scent of lavender fill your mind. Body and spirit together, as they should be. All is in order. All is as it should be. Rest. How it was grown. We have spoken at length about how lavender was used, about its place in medicine and daily life within the monastery walls. But now we must turn our attention to something more fundamental, more earthy. We must speak of the actual growing of the plant, of the soil and sun and water, of the practical knowledge that allowed the monks to reliably produce the lavender they needed year after year. For you see, it is one thing to read in an ancient text that lavender is useful for various ailments. It is quite another thing to actually grow enough lavender to supply those needs. A monastery might have 50 monks, perhaps more. The infirmary would require a steady supply of dried flowers for teas and washes. The housekeeping needs would require more for strewing and sachets. And this supply must be available throughout the year, not just during the growing season. So the gardener monks needed to produce substantial quantities, to harvest at the right time, to dry and store properly. All of this required knowledge, skill, and attention. Let me take you into the physic garden, then, not as a visitor walking through briefly, but as a gardener would experience it, with an eye to the practical details of cultivation. We shall examine how the monks prepared their beds, where they placed their plants, how they cared for them through the seasons. The first consideration for any gardener is location. Where should the lavender bed be placed? The monks, through long experience and through the knowledge passed down from their predecessors, understood that lavender required certain conditions to thrive. It is not a plant that will grow just anywhere, not a plant that tolerates neglect or poor placement. Lavender, you see, comes originally from the Mediterranean regions, from lands where summer is hot and dry, where the sun beats down with intensity, where rain is infrequent for months at a time. It is a plant adapted to harsh conditions, to rocky hillsides, to poor soil, and these origins determine what it needs to grow well in a garden. First and most importantly, lavender must have sun, full sun, as much as possible throughout the day. A location that receives only morning sun, or that is shaded part of the day by buildings or trees, will not do. The plants will grow leggy and weak, will produce fewer flowers, may even succumb to disease. So the monastery gardener, when planning his physic garden, would choose a spot that received full sunlight from morning until evening. Often this meant placing the garden in an open area, away from the tall walls of the monastery buildings, away from large trees. But there was a complication. The garden also needed shelter from strong winds, which could damage the plants and make the space uncomfortable for the monks working there. So ideally, the garden would be in a spot that received sun, but was protected from wind, perhaps by lower walls or by the arrangement of buildings. Many monasteries, you understand, were built around a central courtyard or cloister. This provided an ideal location for gardens. The courtyard would be open to the sky, receiving full sun, but surrounded by covered walkways and buildings that provided shelter from wind. Some monasteries placed their physic gardens in such cloisters, others in separate enclosed gardens nearby. The principle was the same: sun and shelter together. Having chosen the location, the gardener must then prepare the soil. And here we come to something crucial about lavender. It does not want rich, fertile soil. This seems backward, does it not? We think of gardens as needing good, rich earth, well composted, full of nutrients, and indeed, many plants thrive in such conditions. But lavender is different. In its native habitat, lavender grows in poor soil, in rocky places where few other plants can thrive. It has adapted to these conditions. Its roots go deep, seeking out moisture and nutrients far below the surface. If planted in rich soil, if given too much fertility, lavender grows too lush, too green. The stems become soft and prone to disease. The scent, remarkably, becomes less intense. The plant, in a sense, becomes lazy, losing the concentrated quality that makes it valuable. So the monks, if they found themselves with rich garden soil, would actually modify it to make it less fertile for the lavender. They might add sand to lighten it, or small stones, or lime. The goal was to create soil that drained quickly, that did not hold moisture, that forced the plant to be somewhat stressed, somewhat challenged. This stress, this difficulty, is what produces the best lavender, compact plants with woody stems and intensely fragrant flowers. The drainage is particularly important. Lavender cannot tolerate wet feet, as gardeners say. If the roots sit in water, if the soil remains damp for extended periods, the plant will develop root rot and die. This is especially a concern in northern European climates, where rainfall is more frequent and abundant than in lavender's native Mediterranean home. To address this drainage requirement, many monasteries built raised beds for their lavender. Rather than planting directly in the ground, they would construct beds raised above the surrounding level, perhaps a foot or more high. The beds would be bordered with stone or wood to hold the soil in place. This elevation allowed excess water to drain away quickly, prevented the soil from becoming waterlogged even during periods of heavy rain. The soil used to fill these raised beds would be carefully prepared. A mixture, perhaps, of the existing garden soil with added sand and small stones. If the monastery was in an area with limestone, crushed limestone might be added, for lavender prefers slightly alkaline soil, and limestone provides this. The monks would not have understood soil in our modern terms, but they knew through observation that lavender grew better in certain types of soil than in others, and they replicated the conditions that produced the best results. Within these prepared beds, the lavender would be planted in orderly rows or patterns. The monks were fond of order, of geometry, of clear organization. Their gardens reflected this. The beds might be square or rectangular, the paths between them straight and well defined, and the lavender itself would be arranged with regularity. Often, lavender was used as edging, planted along the borders of beds to define them clearly. A path might run through the garden with lavender, planted on both sides, creating low hedges that guided one's movement through the space. This served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Practically, it made the best use of space, allowing other plants to be grown in the center of the beds while the lavender occupied the edges. Aesthetically, it created a pleasing pattern, a sense of order and intention. The spacing of individual plants was important. Too close together, and the plants would compete for light and air, would become crowded and prone to disease. Too far apart, and space would be wasted, the harvest reduced. The monks learned through experience the proper spacing, perhaps 18 inches between plants, enough room for each to develop fully, while still creating a continuous hedge when mature. When to plant. This depended on the climate and the availability of young plants. If the monastery maintained a nursery area where seedlings were grown or cuttings rooted, new plants might be set out in spring after the danger of hard frost had passed. The young plants would then have the entire growing season to establish themselves before facing their first winter. Lavender can be grown from seed, but it is slow and somewhat unreliable. More commonly, the monks would propagate lavender through cuttings. In late summer, after the main harvest, they would take cuttings from the best plants, the ones that had shown the strongest growth and produced the most abundant flowers. These cuttings would be prepared carefully, stripped of their lower leaves, and placed in sandy soil in a sheltered spot to root. This propagation through cuttings had an advantage. It ensured that the new plants would be identical to the parent plants. Good characteristics would be preserved. If a particular plant had especially fragrant flowers or particularly compact growth, those traits would be passed on to all the plants grown from its cuttings. Over time, through this careful selection, the monastery's lavender would become better adapted to local conditions, more productive, more suited to the specific uses the monks had for it. Once planted, the young lavender requires some attention, though not as much as many other garden plants. The newly planted lavender needs moisture to establish its roots, but even then, one must be moderate. Water thoroughly but infrequently, allowing the soil to dry somewhat between waterings. This encourages the roots to grow deep, seeking moisture below the surface, which will serve the plant well once it is established. Once the plant is established, After the first year, it needs very little watering, except in times of extreme drought. Remember, lavender is adapted to dry conditions. It actually performs better with less water than with more. The monastery gardener would not be out watering the lavender the way he might water the vegetables in the kitchen garden. The lavender, once established, largely takes care of itself in this regard. But there is one task that the gardener must not neglect, and that is pruning. Lavender, left to itself, will gradually become woody and sparse. The lower stems will become bare, the plant will spread outward and lose its compact form, the flower production will decline. To prevent this, to keep the plants productive and shapely, annual pruning is necessary. The timing of this pruning matters. After the main harvest in summer, when the flower stems have been cut for drying, the plants are already partially pruned. But in early spring, before new growth begins in earnest, the gardener should go through the lavender beds with his shears and prune again. He will cut back perhaps a third of the previous year's growth, shaping each plant into a neat mound, removing any dead wood, encouraging the plant to put out new growth from the base, rather than just extending the old woody stems. This pruning is careful work. Cut too much, cutting back into the old wood below where there are green leaves, and the plant may not recover, may die back entirely. The gardener must learn to read the plant, to see where the line is between the old wood and the newer growth that can safely be cut. This is knowledge that comes with experience, with years of working with the same plants, learning their responses. The monastery gardener would take his time with this work. Perhaps over several days in early spring, he would work his way through the lavender beds, pruning each plant carefully, examining it as he worked, noting which plant seemed strong and which might be weakening. The woody stems cut away would not be wasted. They could be bundled and dried for kindling, or used in the smoke for fumigation, making use of every part of the plant. Perhaps checking for any signs of disease or pest problems, though lavender is relatively resistant to such troubles. Mostly, it is a matter of observation, of noting how the plants are doing, of accumulating that long-term knowledge of how these particular plants in this particular location respond to the weather, to the seasons, to the care they receive. And then comes the harvest, the culmination of the year's growth. The timing of the harvest is important. Too early, and the flowers will not have developed their full scent, their full concentration of the precious oils that give lavender its properties. Too late, and the flowers will have begun to fade, will have lost some of their potency. The ideal time is when the flowers are just fully open, when the color is at its deepest, when the scent is strongest. This usually occurs in July. He will walk through the beds, examining the flowers, perhaps rubbing a few between his fingers to release the scent, making his judgment about when to begin the harvest. The harvest itself is done on a dry day, preferably in the morning after the dew has dried, but before the heat of the day is at its peak. Wet lavender will mold if bundled and hung to dry, so it is essential that the plants be dry when cut, and harvesting in the cooler morning hours is easier on both the gardener and the plants. The gardener moves through the beds with a sharp knife or shears. He cuts the flowering stems long, taking not just the flower spike itself, but a good length of stem below it. This serves multiple purposes. The long stems make it easier to bundle the lavender for drying. The cutting itself serves as a partial pruning, encouraging the plant to put out new growth, and the stems themselves contain aromatic oils, not as concentrated as in the flowers, but still valuable. As he cuts, he lays the stems carefully in bundles. This is meditative work, repetitive but requiring attention. Cut, gather, move to the next plant. Cut, gather, move on. The strong scent of lavender fills the air, released by the cutting almost overwhelming in its intensity when one is surrounded by it for hours. When he has harvested as much as needed, the stems are taken to a drying area. This must be a space that is sheltered from rain, but well ventilated, out of direct sunlight, which would fade the color and potentially degrade the oils. Often, an upper floor of a barn or storage building would be used. The lavender stems are tied in small bundles and hung upside down from beams or poles, spaced so that air can circulate around them. Over the course of a week or two, depending on the humidity, the lavender will dry. The stems become brittle, the flowers hold their color, though it deepens and dulls somewhat, and the scent, while changing slightly, remains strong. This dried lavender will supply the monastery's needs for the coming year, stored in closed containers to protect it from moisture and dust, available whenever the infirmarian or the housekeeping monks need it. And so the cycle completes, from the carefully prepared bed, from the young plant set out and tended, from the mature plant shaped by pruning, from the harvest at just the right moment, from the careful drying and storage, comes the supply of lavender that the monastery depends upon. It is a yearly rhythm, repeated in the same way generation after generation, a practice refined over centuries into a reliable system. The gardener monk, when he is old, and training a younger monk to take over his duties, will pass on all of this knowledge. He will show the young man where the lavender beds are, will explain about the soil and the drainage and the sun. He will demonstrate the proper pruning technique, the right time to harvest, the correct way to bundle and hang the stems for drying, and the young monk will learn, will begin to develop his own relationship with these plants, will in turn pass the knowledge on when his time comes. This is how knowledge of cultivation survives, how practices are maintained, not through books alone, though the written herbals contain much information, but through this direct transmission, through working alongside someone who knows, through learning by doing, through the accumulated wisdom of practice. The lavender growing in the monastery garden is connected to all the lavender that came before, back through the centuries to those wild plants growing on Mediterranean hillsides. The monks who tend it are connected to all the gardeners who came before, back to the first person who decided to bring lavender into cultivation, to plant it deliberately, rather than simply gathering it from the wild. And we, when we grow lavender in our own gardens, when we prepare our soil and choose our locations and prune our plants, we are connected to those monastery gardeners, following the same principles, applying the same knowledge, participating in the same ancient practice of cultivation. Let us rest here in the garden, in the practical work of growing. Let your mind settle on the image of neat beds, purple flowers in orderly rows, the gardener moving among them with his tools, attending to each plant with care. There is something deeply satisfying about this, about the marriage of knowledge and practice, about the patient work of cultivation that yields its harvest in due season. All is in order. The plants are tended. Rest now in this knowledge, in this connection to the earth and the cycles of growth. Rest. Propagation and harvest. We have spoken of where lavender grows and how it is maintained. But now we must delve more deeply into two particular aspects of the gardener's art: the propagation of new plants and the harvest of flowers. These are moments when the gardener's skill is most clearly tested, when careful hands and accumulated knowledge make all the difference between success and failure, between abundance and scarcity. Let us begin with propagation, with the question of how the monastery increases its stock of lavender plants. For the physic garden is not a static thing, unchanging from year to year. Plants age and eventually fail. Harsh winters may kill some plants. The monastery's needs may grow as the community expands, or perhaps there is a daughter house being established elsewhere, and they need plants to start their own garden, or a neighboring monastery requests some plants, for the communities often helped one another in such matters. So the gardener must be able to create new plants to expand his stock reliably. And as I mentioned earlier, while lavender can be grown from seed, this is not the preferred method. Seeds are slow to germinate, the young seedlings are delicate, and there is variation in the offspring. A plant grown from seed may not have the same qualities as its parent, may be less fragrant or less vigorous or different in growth habit. No, the monastery gardener relies primarily on two methods, taking cuttings and dividing existing plants. Both techniques allow him to create plants that are identical to the parent, that carry forward all the desirable characteristics that have been selected for over the years. Let us speak first of cuttings, for this is the more common method, and the one that requires the most skill and attention. The principle is simple enough. A piece of the plant is cut away and encouraged to form its own roots, becoming a separate individual. But the execution requires knowledge and care. The timing matters first of all. Cuttings can be taken at different times of year, but late summer is generally preferred, after the main harvest, when the plants have been cut back and are putting out new growth. These young shoots, neither too soft nor too woody, are ideal for cutting material. They are vigorous, ready to grow, but mature enough to have some resilience. The gardener walks through the lavender beds, examining the plants, selecting his candidates. He looks for the healthiest, most productive plants, the ones that have shown the best growth this year, that have produced the most flowers, that have the strongest scent. Thus ensuring that the next generation will inherit these desirable qualities. He selects a shoot, one of the young growths coming from the base of the plant or from the stems that were cut back after harvest. It should be perhaps 3 or 4 inches long, with healthy leaves, showing vigorous growth. With a sharp knife, for a clean cut is essential, he severs the shoot from the parent plant. This is done carefully, cutting at an angle, taking care not to damage the parent plant more than necessary. Now the cutting must be prepared. The lower leaves are stripped away, leaving bare stem at the bottom, and leaves only at the top. This bare stem is what will be placed in the soil, and we do not want leaves below the surface where they would only rot. Some gardeners make a small wound in the stem at the base, scraping away a bit of the outer layer. This is said to encourage root formation, though I cannot say with certainty whether it truly helps. It is one of those practices that is passed down, that some swear by and others consider unnecessary. The prepared cutting is then placed in a pot or in a specially prepared nursery bed. The soil must be very different from the well-drained, rather poor soil that mature lavender prefers. For rooting cuttings, we want soil that holds moisture but does not become waterlogged. A mixture of sand and a little good soil, or sand and peat if the monastery has access to it, creates the right texture. The soil should be moist but not wet, friable, easy for tender new roots to penetrate. The cutting is inserted into this soil, deep enough to be stable, but not so deep that too much of the stem is buried, perhaps an inch or 2 of stem below the surface. The soil is firmed gently around it. If multiple cuttings are being taken, as is usually the case, they are spaced a few inches apart in the nursery bed, or several can be placed around the edge of a pot. And now comes the waiting, the period of greatest vulnerability. The cutting has no roots. It cannot yet draw water from the soil. It must survive on the moisture in its tissues, while it attempts to form new roots. Many cuttings fail at this stage, drying out before roots can develop. The nursery bed or pots are placed in a sheltered location, somewhere that receives light but not direct, harsh sun. Too much sun will cause the cutting to dry out, too little and it will not have the energy to form roots. A spot that receives morning sun but is shaded during the hottest part of the day is ideal. The monastery cloister with its covered walkways often provides such spots. The soil must be kept moist, but again not wet. This requires attention, especially in dry weather. The gardener will check the cuttings daily, perhaps misting them lightly with water, ensuring they do not dry out, but equally ensuring they do not sit in soggy soil where rot would develop. Some monasteries, if they had access to such materials, would cover the cuttings with glass cloches or with oiled cloth to create a more humid environment, to slow the loss of moisture from the leaves. This helps, but it also creates risk, for the enclosed humid environment can encourage mold and rot if not carefully managed. The covering must be lifted periodically to allow air circulation, a balance maintained between humidity and ventilation. For several weeks, nothing much appears to happen. The cutting sits there, perhaps looking a bit wilted, giving no sign of whether it lives or dies. This is a test of patience. The gardener must resist the temptation to pull at the cutting to see if roots have formed, for disturbing it at this delicate stage could kill it. He must simply maintain conditions and wait. But then, if all goes well, after perhaps 3 or 4 weeks, the cutting begins to show signs of new growth. A tiny new leaf may appear at the tip. The color improves, the leaves becoming more turgid, standing up rather than drooping. These are signs that roots have formed, that the cutting has become a new plant capable of sustaining itself. Even then, the gardener does not rush to transplant. The new roots are delicate, the plant still vulnerable. It is better to let it remain in the nursery bed through the first winter, protected, allowed to develop a stronger root system. In the following spring, when growth begins again, the young plant can be moved to its permanent location in the physic garden. The other method of propagation division is simpler, but can only be used with established plants that have formed multiple crowns. An old lavender plant, if it has been well maintained, will often develop several distinct centers of growth, several crowns all growing from the same root system. In early spring, before growth begins, such a plant can be carefully dug up and divided. This is heavy work, for an old lavender plant has extensive roots, woody and tough. The gardener must dig carefully around the plant, loosening the soil, getting his spade deep enough to get under the root ball. Once the plant is free of the ground, he can examine it and determine how it might be divided. Sometimes the plant will naturally separate into sections with a little pulling and twisting. Other times, it may be necessary to use a sharp spade or even a knife to cut through the woody root crown. Each division must have both roots and shoots, both what is below ground and what is above. A piece of root without shoots will not grow. Shoots without adequate roots will die. The divisions are then replanted immediately. Before their roots can dry out, they are given the same well-drained soil that mature lavender prefers, watered in well, and then watched carefully for the first few weeks to ensure they are establishing. Usually, if the division was done properly and the pieces were of good size, the plants will settle in and begin growing as though they had always been separate individuals. Division has the advantage that it produces larger plants immediately, plants that may even flower in their first year. But it can only be done occasionally, and it requires sacrificing the parent plant, or at least significantly disrupting it. Cuttings, though more delicate and slower, allow the gardener to produce many new plants without disturbing his existing stock. There is one more detail about the propagation of young plants that deserves mention, a practice that requires discipline but pays dividends in the long term. when a lavender plant is in its first year, whether grown from a cutting or from a division, it may attempt to flower. The buds will form, the flowering stems begin to elongate. The experienced gardener will pinch these off, will remove the flower buds before they open. This seems wasteful, does it not? The flowers are what we want after all, but the wisdom is sound. If a young plant is allowed to flower in its first year, it puts its energy into flower and seed production rather than into developing a strong root system and sturdy framework of stems. The result is a weaker plant that will be less productive in future years. By pinching off those first-year flowers, by forcing the plant to redirect its energy into growth rather than reproduction, the gardener ensures that in the second year and all the years after, the plant will be stronger, larger, more productive. It is a small sacrifice in the first year for much greater yields in all the years to come. This requires discipline, I say, because it goes against the natural desire to see results immediately. But the monastery gardens operated on a time scale longer than a single season. They were thinking years ahead. A plant properly established in its first year would produce abundantly for 10 years or more. That long-term thinking, that willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future benefit, is part of what made the monastery gardens so successful. Now let us turn from propagation to harvest, from the creation of new plants to the gathering of what the mature plants produce. The harvest is the culmination of the year's work, the moment when all the tending and watching and waiting results in the bundles of dried lavender that will serve the monastery's needs. The timing of the harvest, as I have mentioned, is crucial. The gardener has been watching the lavender beds closely as summer progresses. The flower spikes have formed, the buds have appeared, have begun to swell and show color. Day by day he watches, waiting for the moment when the flowers are fully open but not yet beginning to fade. This moment varies from year to year depending on the weather. A hot, dry summer will bring the flowers on earlier. A cool, wet summer may delay them. There is no calendar date that can be relied upon absolutely. The gardener must judge by observation, by experience, by that accumulated knowledge that comes from years of watching the same plants in the same location. When he determines that the time has come, he must also consider the weather. The harvest should be done on a dry day, ideally one that has been preceded by several dry days. Lavender harvested, while damp with dew or rain will not dry properly, will be prone to mold and spoilage. So the gardener watches not only the plants, but also the sky, waiting for the right combination of plant readiness and suitable weather. Let us imagine such a day. The morning dawns clear, the sun rising into a cloudless sky. The dew has dried from the grass by mid-morning. The gardener, after attending the morning prayers and taking a simple meal, gathers his tools and makes his way to the physic garden. He brings a sharp knife or shears, several large baskets, and perhaps a length of cloth to spread the cut stems upon. He begins his work methodically, moving along the first row of lavender. With his shears, he cuts the flowering stems, taking them long as I described earlier. Cut, and the purple stem comes away in his hand, releasing that powerful scent. He lays it in the basket, he moves to the next plant, cuts again, adds to the basket. The work settles into a rhythm, repetitive but requiring enough attention to prevent carelessness. The sun climbs higher, the day grows warm. The scent of lavender surrounds him, thick in the still air of the garden. His hands become sticky with the aromatic oils from the plants. The basket fills, is emptied onto the cloth, fills again. Other monks may come to help if the planting is large, if speed is important to complete the harvest before weather changes. They work together in companionable silence, or perhaps singing one of the hymns they know by heart, the rhythm of the work matching the rhythm of the song. As the stems are cut, they are kept as neat as possible, all oriented the same direction, the flower heads together, the cut ends together. This will make the bundling easier later. Some gardeners bundle as they go, tying small bunches with twine or strips of cloth as soon as they have a handful. Others prefer to cut first and bundle later, spreading all the stems out and then gathering them into uniform bundles. The size of the bundles matters. Too large, and the stems in the center will not dry properly, trapped by the stems around them, remaining damp, potentially rotting or molding. Too small, and the work of tying and hanging becomes tedious, and the storage of many tiny bundles is inefficient. Through experience, the monastery gardener has learned the right size, perhaps 20 or 30 stems per bundle, enough to be efficient, but not so many that drying is compromised. Each bundle is tied firmly near the cut end, the twine wrapped several times and knotted securely. As the lavender dries, the stems will shrink slightly, and if the tie is not firm, the bundle may come loose and fall. This would be a waste, the flowers scattered, bruised, their quality diminished. Once bundled, the lavender is taken to the drying area. This has been prepared in advance, for it would not do to finish cutting and then discover there is nowhere suitable to hang the harvest. The drying space, as I have described, must be sheltered from rain, well ventilated, and out of direct sunlight. Often, an upper floor of a storage building serves well. Poles or ropes are strung across the space at a height convenient for hanging bundles. The bundles are hung upside down, the flower heads pointing toward the floor. This serves two purposes. It allows any moisture to drain away from the flowers toward the cut end of the stem, and it keeps the flower heads in their natural position as they dry, preventing the flowers from becoming distorted. The bundles are spaced along the hanging lines with a hand's width or so between them. They must not touch each other, for that would prevent air from circulating around them. The still, dusty air of the drying room becomes perfumed with lavender, the scent almost overwhelming when one first enters, but gradually becoming familiar, the nose adjusting to the constant presence of it. And now again comes waiting. The lavender hangs in the dim, warm space, and over days the moisture gradually leaves it. The stems, which were flexible when cut, become brittle. The leaves, which were soft, become crisp. The flowers, which were bright purple, deepen to a more muted shade, but retain their essential color. The transformation from fresh to dried is gradual, not always obvious from day to day, but unmistakable when comparing newly hung bundles to those that have been drying for a week or two. The gardener checks periodically, squeezing a stem to judge its dryness, rubbing flowers between his fingers to see if they have reached the right consistency. When the stems snap, rather than bend, when the flowers are papery and dry to the touch, the lavender is ready for storage. The bundles are taken down and stored in a dry place, protected from light and moisture. Some monasteries had dedicated storage rooms for dried herbs. Others kept them in wooden chests or hung them in dry corners of storage buildings. What matters is that the dried lavender be kept dry and protected until it is needed. From these stored bundles, flowers can be stripped as needed throughout the year. The infirmarian takes what he needs for medicines. The housekeeping monks take what they need for strewing and sachets. The stored lavender represents the year's supply, the harvest carefully timed, carefully executed, carefully dried and stored, now available to serve the monastery's needs until next summer brings another harvest. This cycle, this rhythm of propagation and growth and harvest and storage and use repeats year after year. Each year the gardener learns something new, notices some detail, refines his technique. Each year the knowledge deepens, and each year the lavender provides, reliably, abundantly, if it is treated with the care and attention it requires. The hands that cut the flowers, that tie the bundles, that hang them to dry, these are careful hands, practiced hands, hands that have learned through repetition, through mistakes corrected, through successes repeated. They are the hands of workers who understand that the quality of their attention directly affects the quality of what they produce. This is honest work, this propagation, and it connects the worker directly to the earth, to the plants, to the cycles of seasons. There is satisfaction in it, the satisfaction of competence, of skill applied, of results that can be seen and touched and smelled. The monk who tends the lavender may not receive worldly recognition for his work, but he knows its value. He sees the bundles drying, knows they will serve good purposes, knows his labor is worthwhile. Let us rest here, in this knowledge of careful work, of skilled hands, of attention paid to detail. Let us think on the gardener in his work, the rhythmic cutting, the tying of bundles, the hanging of stems to dry. There is something peaceful in this, in work that is repetitive but meaningful, in labor that produces visible, tangible results. The harvest is in. The bundles hang drying in the dim, scented air. All is proceeding as it should. The cycle continues. Rest now in this satisfaction, in this completion of the season's work. Lavender as medicine. We have followed lavender from seed and cutting to harvest and storage. Now we must turn our attention to what happens next, to the actual use of this carefully tended, carefully harvested plant in the treatment of human ailments. For all the cultivation, all the labor of growing and gathering finds its purpose here, in the relief of suffering, in the easing of discomfort, in the attempt to restore health to the sick body and peace to the troubled mind. Let me speak to you now as an apothecary speaks, from the perspective of one who has spent a lifetime preparing remedies, observing their effects, learning which preparations work best for which complaints. I shall describe for you the various ailments that lavender has been used to treat, and the forms in which it has been prepared and administered. This is practical knowledge, accumulated over centuries, tested through long experience. Let us begin with the nervous complaints, for these are perhaps where lavender has shown itself most reliably useful. By nervous complaints, I mean those afflictions of the mind and spirit that have no obvious physical cause, that arise from within, from the nature of the person or from the circumstances of their life. Anxiety, we call it, worry, nervous agitation, the inability to be calm, to be at peace. You know this feeling, surely. The mind that races, moving from thought to thought without rest. The tension in the muscles, the tightness in the chest, the sense that something terrible is about to happen, though there is no rational cause for such fear. This is anxiety, and it is more common than we often acknowledge. It afflicts the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the learned and the simple. For such complaints, lavender has long been valued. A tea made from the flowers, taken in the evening, has a calming effect. The person who drinks it finds after a time that the racing thoughts slow, that the tightness in the chest eases. The sense of impending doom recedes, not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually, gently, like the ebbing of a tide. A measure of dried lavender flowers, perhaps a teaspoon or two, placed in a cup. Boiling water poured over, allowed to steep for several minutes until the water has taken on the color and scent of the lavender. Strained and drunk, perhaps with honey, added to soften the taste. This can be taken once daily or twice if the anxiety is severe, morning and evening. Similarly, lavender helps with melancholy, that deep sadness that settles over a person like a heavy cloak, making all of life seem grey and burdensome. Melancholy was understood by the ancients as an imbalance of the humours, an excess of black bile in the system. We might describe it differently now, but the experience remains the same, a persistent sadness, a loss of pleasure in things that once brought joy, a heaviness of spirit that makes even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Lavender cannot cure deep melancholy, particularly if it arises from genuine sorrow or difficult circumstances. But it can provide some ease, some lifting of the spirit. The scent itself seems to have this effect. A person suffering from melancholy might keep a sachet of lavender near them, might breathe in its scent deliberately throughout the day. They might add lavender to their bath, letting the warm water and the scent together work their gentle effect. Over time, with regular use, there is often some improvement, some lightening of the heavy mood. Headaches, too, respond to lavender. Not all headaches, certainly. If the head pain comes from a serious cause, from injury or disease, lavender will not cure it. But the common headache, the one that comes from tension or from too much work or from the stuffiness of indoor air, this often responds well to lavender. The remedy can be external or internal. Externally, lavender oil can be rubbed on the temples and the back of the neck. The oil should be diluted, mixed with another oil like olive oil, for pure lavender oil can be too strong for the skin. A few drops of lavender oil in a tablespoon of carrier oil, rubbed gently into the skin, the fingertips massaging in small circles. The person should then lie down in a quiet, darkened room if possible, and rest. Often, within half an hour, the headache will have lessened. Internally, the lavender tea I described earlier can be drunk. Some people find that lavender wine, a spoonful or two, provides even better relief for headaches. Though, of course, one must be moderate with wine, as a medicine lest the remedy create new problems. For insomnia, for the inability to fall asleep or to stay asleep through the night, lavender has been used since ancient times. The Romans knew this. The medieval monks knew this. There is something about the scent of lavender that invites sleep, that quiets the mind, that allows the body to relax into rest. The traditional preparation is a pillow filled with dried lavender flowers or a small sachet tucked inside the regular pillow near where the head rests. As the person lies down, as their weight compresses the pillow, the scent is released gently, continuously throughout the night. They breathe it in with every breath, and it works its subtle effect, easing them into sleep, helping them to remain asleep through the night hours. Some people prefer to drink lavender tea before bed, combining the internal and external approach. The warm liquid itself is soothing. The scent rises with the steam, and the properties of the lavender work from within as well as without. This combination often proves quite effective for those who struggle with sleep. Now let us turn to digestive complaints, for these too are a common use of lavender. Indigestion, we call it, that uncomfortable feeling after eating, when the stomach seems to rebel against what has been given it. There is bloating, perhaps, or cramping, or a burning sensation, or simply a general sense of digestive unease. This can come from eating too much, or from eating rich or spoiled food, or from nervous tension affecting the digestion. Lavender tea, taken after a meal, helps to settle the digestion. It seems to relax the muscles of the stomach and intestines, allowing them to move food through properly rather than cramping or remaining too still. It also seems to reduce the production of gas, that uncomfortable bloating that often accompanies indigestion. The tea should be taken warm but not hot, sipped slowly rather than gulped. Often within a quarter hour, the person will feel relief, the discomfort easing, the digestion resuming its normal function. This can be used regularly if someone suffers from chronic digestive troubles. A cup of lavender tea taken after the main meal of the day as a preventive measure. For wounds, lavender has been valued since the Romans used it to treat soldiers' injuries. When the skin is broken, when there is a cut or scrape or puncture, the wound must be cleaned to prevent infection and then protected as it heals. Lavender serves both purposes. A lavender wash, made by steeping lavender in hot water and then allowing it to cool, can be used to clean wounds. The liquid is poured over the injury or applied with a clean cloth, washing away dirt and blood. The properties of lavender help to kill or inhibit the growth of the organisms that cause infection. This is not infallible, of course. A deep or serious wound requires more than lavender. But for minor injuries, lavender wash is quite effective. After cleaning, a lavender salve can be applied. This is made, as I described earlier, by infusing lavender in oil and perhaps thickening it with beeswax. The salve creates a protective layer over the wound, keeps it moist, which promotes healing, and continues to provide the antimicrobial effects of the lavender. The wound should be washed and redressed daily, fresh salve applied each time until healing is complete. Burns, too, are treated with lavender. Not severe burns, you understand. A serious burn requires immediate care and is beyond the scope of simple herbal remedies. But a minor burn, such as one might get from touching a hot pot or getting too close to a fire, these respond well to lavender. The burned area should first be cooled, held under cool water, or covered with a cool, wet cloth. Once the heat has been drawn out, lavender oil diluted in a carrier oil can be applied gently. This soothes the pain remarkably well and seems to promote healing, reducing the likelihood of scarring. The oil can be reapplied several times daily until the burn has healed. Insect bites. Those itchy, irritating bumps that appear after mosquitoes or fleas or other biting insects have fed upon us. These too are eased by lavender. A drop of lavender oil applied directly to the bite reduces the itching and swelling. The relief is not complete, but it is noticeable and welcome. In summer, when biting insects are most active, it is worth keeping a small bottle of lavender oil close to hand for this purpose. For lice, those troublesome parasites that infest the hair and scalp, lavender is used as a preventive and sometimes as a treatment. Lice, you understand, are a constant problem in any age before modern sanitation and hygiene. They spread easily, particularly among children or among people living in close quarters. They cause intense itching and can carry disease. Lavender oil added to washing water or rubbed into the hair seems to discourage lice. They dislike the scent or the properties of lavender and are less likely to infest someone who regularly uses it. For an existing infestation, lavender alone may not be sufficient. Other stronger remedies may be needed, but as part of a treatment regime, it helps, and as a preventive measure, it is quite valuable. For respiratory complaints, for coughs and congested chests and difficulty breathing, lavender has its place as well, though I must say it is not the primary remedy for such things. Other herbs, such as horehound or coltsfoot, are more directly effective for coughs. But lavender can be part of a combination, and its calming properties can ease the anxiety and distress that often accompany breathing difficulties. A steam inhalation with lavender can be helpful. Hot water in a bowl, a handful of lavender flowers added, the person leaning over the bowl with a cloth draped over their head to capture the steam. They breathe deeply, the warm, moist, lavender-scented air soothing the irritated passages of nose and throat, loosening congestion, easing the cough. This can be done several times daily during illness. Lavender can also be part of a chest rub. The oil mixed with other oils and rubbed onto the chest and back to ease congestion and coughing. The warmth of the skin releases the aromatic vapors, which are then breathed in throughout the night, providing continuous relief. Now let me speak of the various forms in which lavender is prepared, for I have mentioned several and there are more, and it is worth understanding each clearly. The simplest preparation is the infusion, what I have been calling lavender tea. Dried flowers steeped in hot water, strained and drunk. This is easy to prepare, requires no special equipment or skill, and is effective for internal use. Lavender wine is made by steeping lavender flowers in wine for several days or weeks, then straining. The wine extracts different compounds than water does, and some people find this preparation more effective, particularly for nervous complaints and for promoting sleep. A small amount, a tablespoonful or two, is taken as needed. The wine also acts as a preservative, allowing the preparation to be stored for months without spoiling. A tincture is similar, but uses a stronger alcohol, spirits rather than wine. Lavender flowers are covered with alcohol and left for several weeks, shaken daily, then strained. The resulting tincture is very concentrated and is used in small doses, perhaps 10 or 20 drops in water. Tinctures have the advantage of being very long-lasting and requiring only small amounts for effect. Lavender oil is made by infusing the flowers in oil, as I have described. This is for external use, not to be taken internally. The oil can be used alone, or as the base for salves and ointments, thickened with beeswax or other substances, to create a preparation that stays on the skin, rather than running off. Lavender water is made by distillation, a more complex process requiring special equipment. The flowers are heated with water in a still, and the aromatic steam is collected and condensed. The resulting lavender water is both fragrant and medicinally active, can be used externally or internally, and keeps well. Not every apothecary or monastery would have the equipment for distillation, but those that do prize lavender water highly. For external use beyond oils and waters, there are also lavender baths. A large quantity of lavender, either fresh or dried, is tied in a cloth bag and added to the bath water, or an infusion is made and poured into the bath. The person soaks in the scented water, absorbing the properties of the lavender through the skin and breathing in the aromatic steam. This is particularly good for nervous conditions, for sore muscles, for skin irritations, for general promotion of health and well-being. Pillows and sachets I have mentioned. These are for the sustained passive inhalation of lavender's scent. The flowers are dried and placed in cloth bags, which are then positioned where their scent will be regularly encountered, in the bed, in clothing storage, in living spaces. Fumigation involves burning lavender or heating it so it releases its aromatic smoke or vapor into the air. This is done to purify a sick room, to clear the air in a space where disease has been, to create an atmosphere of cleanliness and health. The smoke or vapor fills the space and all who are in it breathe it in. The skilled apothecary knows which to recommend for which complaint, how to prepare each properly, how to instruct the patient in their use. This knowledge is not gained from books alone, though books are valuable. It is gained through practice, through preparing these remedies again and again, through observing their effects, through learning from successes and failures. When someone comes to me with an ailment, I must first determine what is wrong, what is the nature of their complaint. Is it primarily physical, or is there a nervous component? Is it acute, come on suddenly, or chronic, long-standing? How severe is it? What has already been tried? Based on these considerations, I choose the appropriate form of lavender, or perhaps recommend lavender as part of a combination with other herbs. I explain carefully how to prepare and use the remedy. I tell them what to expect, how long before they should see improvement, what signs would indicate they should return for further consultation, and then I follow their progress. When they return, whether to report success or to say the remedy did not help. I learn from this. I adjust my understanding, refine my recommendations. This is how medical practice works, through this careful observation, this accumulation of experience, this constant learning. Lavender is not a cure-all, let me be clear about that. There are many ailments it does not touch, many illnesses where stronger medicines are needed, many conditions that require more than herbs can provide. But within its range of effectiveness for the complaints I have described, lavender is reliable, safe, gentle, and worthwhile. It serves us in our minor troubles, in those daily discomforts that, while not serious, still make life less pleasant than it should be. A headache eased, a troubled sleep improved, an anxious mind calmed, a wound protected. These are not small things to the person suffering. They are real relief, real improvement, real care. And so we return to lavender, again and again, across centuries, across cultures. We grow it, harvest it, prepare it, use it. We trust it because it has earned that trust through consistent, if modest, effectiveness. We pass on the knowledge because it is worth passing on, because others will benefit as we have benefited. Let us rest here in this understanding of lavender as medicine. Think on the various ailments, the various remedies, the careful matching of preparation to complaint. There is order here, system, accumulated wisdom. The apothecary's shelves are lined with bottles and jars, each containing something useful, something that serves health and eases suffering, and among those bottles and jars, lavender has its honored place, reliable, familiar, trusted. Rest now in this knowledge. Rest. Headaches, sleep, and the power of scent. We have spoken broadly of lavender's medicinal uses, cataloguing the various ailments it addresses, the various preparations employed. But now, as we draw toward the close of this evening's discourse, let us narrow our focus. Let us speak more intimately, more personally, about two particular afflictions that touch nearly everyone at some time in their lives, the headache and the sleepless night. And let us consider, more deeply than we have yet done, the peculiar power of scent itself, that most mysterious of the senses, that most direct pathway to memory and emotion and relief. I speak of these matters from long experience, you understand. I am an old man now, and I have known many headaches in my time. I have lain awake through many nights when sleep would not come, and I have, through trial and observation, learned what brings relief, what allows the pain to ease, what invites sleep to return. Lavender has been my companion in these struggles, as it has been companion to countless others across the centuries. Let me speak first of the headache, that common torment. You know the feeling, surely. It begins, perhaps, with a slight tightness across the forehead or at the temples. You notice it, but hope it will pass. You continue with your work, your reading, your tasks. Instead, it grows, the tightness becoming pressure, the pressure becoming pain. The pain settles in, persistent, throbbing perhaps, or steady like a band of iron around the skull. Light becomes too bright, sound becomes too loud. The simple act of thinking requires effort. This is the common headache, not caused by serious disease, but by the ordinary stresses of life. Perhaps you have worked too long by candlelight, straining your eyes. Perhaps you have been in a stuffy room with poor air. Perhaps you have worried overmuch about some matter, tensing your neck and shoulders without realizing it. Perhaps you have eaten something that disagreed with you, or drunk too much wine the night before. The causes are many, but the result is the same: pain, discomfort, the inability to focus or work or find peace. What does one do? The first thing always is to stop what one is doing, if possible. To cease the work, to move away from the source of strain. These simple measures often help, but sometimes they are not enough. The headache persists, demanding more active intervention. This is when I turn to lavender in several forms, used in combination for the best effect. First, I prepare a cup of lavender tea. The familiar ritual of it is itself somewhat soothing, measuring the dried flowers, pouring the hot water, waiting while it steeps, watching the color change, breathing in the rising steam. Already, before I have drunk a sip, the scent is working on me, beginning to ease the tension. I add honey to the tea, for sweetness helps, and I drink it slowly, sitting quietly, not rushing. The warm liquid going down is comforting. The properties of the lavender begin their work from within, relaxing the blood vessels that may be involved in the headache, calming the nervous system that is transmitting the pain signals, easing the tension in muscles I did not even realize were tight. But the tea alone is sometimes not sufficient. So I also prepare a compress. I take a clean cloth, dip it in cool lavender water, water in which lavender has been steeped and then allowed to cool, or if I am fortunate enough to have it, distilled lavender water. I wring out the excess liquid so the cloth is damp but not dripping, and I fold it and place it across my forehead and temples, lying back, closing my eyes. The coolness itself is soothing. The scent, so close to my nose, fills each breath, and the properties of the lavender, absorbed through the skin, work locally on the painful areas. I lie like this for perhaps a quarter of an hour, renewing the cloth when it becomes warm from my skin, breathing slowly and deliberately, letting the tension drain away. Sometimes I also apply lavender oil, mixed with a little olive oil so it is not too strong, rubbed gently into the temples and the back of the neck. The act of rubbing, the gentle circular motion, is itself therapeutic. It releases tension in the small muscles of the scalp and neck, and the oil carries the properties of lavender directly through the skin to the tissues beneath. What happens then, if all goes well? Gradually, slowly, the pain begins to lessen. It does not disappear instantly. Lavender is gentle, not forceful, but after perhaps half an hour, I notice that the throbbing has quieted. After an hour, I can open my eyes without discomfort, can think clearly again. Sometimes I fall asleep there, with the compress still on my forehead, and wake an hour or two later with the headache entirely gone. Not every headache responds so well. Some are stubborn, rooted in causes that lavender cannot address, but many do respond, more often than not. And even when the headache is not entirely eliminated, it is reduced, made bearable, brought down from the realm of acute suffering to mere discomfort. This is what lavender offers, not miracles, but reliable, gentle relief. And sometimes that is precisely what is needed. Now let us speak of sleep, or rather of the lack of sleep, of the long night hours spent awake while the body craves rest that will not come. This, too, is a torment known to many. The body is tired, exhausted even. The mind knows that tomorrow will be difficult without sleep. But despite this knowledge, despite the weariness, sleep does not arrive. One lies in bed, willing oneself to sleep, and that very willing makes sleep impossible. The mind races, it reviews the day just past, worries about the day to come. It rehearses conversations, plans tasks, frets over problems. One shifts position, seeking the comfortable spot that will allow sleep to come. But no position seems right. The bed feels hard, the pillow uncomfortable, the blanket too heavy or too light. The hours pass. One hears the night sounds, the settling of the house, the cry of an owl, the distant bark of a dog, and always there is the awareness of time passing, of the night being consumed, of tomorrow approaching too quickly when one has not yet rested for today. I know this experience well. In my younger years, I slept easily, instantly, without thought. But age has brought a tendency toward wakefulness, a lightness of sleep that is easily disturbed. and worry, of which there is no shortage in any age, has often kept me awake long past the time I should be sleeping. For this affliction, lavender has been my greatest ally. I learned its value first from my grandmother, who kept a lavender pillow and swore by its properties. I thought in my youth that this was superstition, old wives' tales. But when I began to struggle with sleep myself, I tried it and found that the old knowledge was sound. The lavender pillow is simplicity itself. A small cloth bag sewn shut after being filled with dried lavender flowers. This is placed inside the regular pillow, or beside it, or sometimes just near the head on the bed. As one lies down, as one's head settles into place, the weight compresses the pillow slightly, and the scent is released gently, continuously. One breathes it in with every breath, and breath by breath it does its work. The racing mind begins to slow. The body, tense with the effort of trying to sleep, begins to relax. The worries that seemed so urgent begin to recede, to lose their grip, and sleep, which was being chased and therefore fled, begins to approach of its own accord, unbidden, natural. I cannot explain the mechanism of this. I do not know why the scent of lavender should invite sleep while other scents do not, but the effect is real, observable, repeatable. Night after night, the lavender pillow serves its purpose, easing the transition from wakefulness to sleep, helping to maintain that sleep through the night hours. Some people also benefit from drinking lavender tea before bed, the same preparation I described for headaches. A cup taken perhaps an hour before one plans to sleep, sipped slowly while sitting quietly, letting the day's activities settle. The warmth of the drink is itself calming, and the properties of the lavender, taken internally, prepare the body and mind for rest. The large kettle of water heated, poured into a basin or tub, lavender added in abundance. One soaks in the warm, scented water, feeling the heat relax the muscles, breathing in the aromatic steam. All the day's tensions, all the accumulated tightness in the body begin to release. When one steps out of the bath and dries off and goes to bed, sleep comes easily, naturally, as it should. But let us consider now, more carefully, this matter of scent itself. Why should smell, of all the senses, have this power? We can close our eyes to block out sight, we can cover our ears to muffle sound, but we cannot stop breathing, cannot cease to smell without ceasing to live. The nose takes in air continuously, and with that air comes scent, and scent goes directly, immediately to the oldest parts of the brain, the parts that govern emotion and memory and basic responses. This is why a scent can evoke memory so powerfully. The smell of bread baking brings back childhood, the mother's kitchen, feelings of safety and care. The smell of wood smoke evokes winter evenings, the gathering of family, warmth against the cold. These connections are not made through conscious thought. They are automatic, involuntary, arising from the deep structure of how we are made. And this is why lavender's scent is so effective. It is not that we remember intellectually that lavender is for calm and sleep. Rather, if we have had experience with lavender in contexts of cleanliness, of care, of rest, then the scent itself evokes those states. The body and mind respond without the need for conscious intervention. This is the power of scent, more profound and more mysterious than we often acknowledge. In an age when we have learned to distrust the senses, when we value only what can be measured and proven, we forget that the senses themselves are forms of knowledge, that the body knows things the mind does not explicitly understand. When I breathe in the scent of lavender, my body knows at a level deeper than words or thoughts that this scent means calm, means cleanliness, means the easing of pain, means the coming of sleep. And knowing this, the body responds accordingly. The muscles relax, the breathing deepens, the mind quiets, sleep approaches. This is not magic, though it may seem so. It is the natural response of a body that has learned, through repeated experience, what lavender means. And because humans have been using lavender for these purposes for thousands of years, because generation after generation has associated this scent with these states, perhaps there is even something deeper, something carried in memory that goes beyond individual experience. I speak carefully here, for I do not want to stray into fancy. But I wonder sometimes whether the long association between humanity and lavender has created a kind of resonance, a recognition that goes deeper than individual learning. Whether the scent of lavender speaks to something ancient in us, something that remembers countless nights of peaceful sleep, countless moments of pain eased, countless times when this purple flower brought comfort to suffering humans. But perhaps that is the speculation of an old man, prone to sentiment as age often makes us. What I know for certain is this: when my head aches and I breathe in lavender's scent, the pain eases. When I cannot sleep and I rest my head on a lavender pillow, sleep comes. This has been true for me, and I have observed it to be true for countless others across my long years of practice. And so I return to lavender again and again, not as a desperate measure, not with the anxiety of someone trying anything in hope of relief, but with the calm confidence of long familiarity. I know what it will do. I trust it. And that trust itself, that confidence born of experience, is part of what makes the remedy effective. For healing is not only chemistry, not only the physical interaction of plant compounds with body tissues. It is also belief, confidence, the sense that one is being cared for, that relief is possible. When I prepare my lavender tea, when I lie down with my compress, when I breathe in the scent from my pillow, I am not merely applying a remedy. I am participating in a tradition of care that extends back thousands of years. I am connecting myself to all those who came before, who also used lavender for these same purposes. And there is comfort in that connection, beyond the physical effects of the plant itself. There is comfort in knowing that this is not new, that I am not alone in my suffering, that others have found this path and left it marked for me to follow. The remedy works not just because of what lavender is, but because of what it represents, what it connects me to, what it allows me to trust. This is the intimate power of lavender, the quiet, personal relief it offers, not dramatic cures, not the sudden elimination of serious disease, but the gentle easing of common suffering, the headache that lessens, the sleep that comes, the moment of peace in a troubled mind. These are small victories, perhaps, but to the person experiencing them, they are everything, and so I end where I began, with scent, with that first encounter between human and plant. Lavender came to us through our noses, through that most direct and mysterious of senses. It has stayed with us because the body recognizes it, responds to it, finds in it something valuable, something worth preserving. When you breathe in the scent of lavender, you are breathing in all of this history, all of this accumulated use, all of these countless moments of relief and comfort and care. You are connecting yourself to the ancient Egyptians who used it in their sacred rites, to the Roman soldiers who carried it on campaign, to the medieval monks who grew it in their gardens, to the apothecaries who prepared it in their shops, to all the suffering humans across all the centuries who found in this simple purple flower some measure of peace. Breathe deeply now. Let the scent fill you. Let your mind quiet. Let your body relax. The pain will ease. The sleep will come. All is well. All is as it should be. Rest now, rest in lavender's gentle embrace, rest in the knowledge that you are cared for, that relief is possible, that this ancient remedy stands ready to serve as it has served so many before you. Rest, just rest. Let go. Sleep comes. All is well. Rest. bridge to the modern world, and so we come at last to the end of our evening's journey through lavender's long history. We have traveled together from ancient times to medieval gardens, from sacred temples to monastery infirmaries, from the theoretical to the deeply practical. But before I bid you good night, before I leave you to your rest, let me speak briefly of how this ancient knowledge traveled forward through time, how it bridged the centuries to reach the world we inhabit now. Rather, it continued, adapted, found new forms and new contexts, while never entirely losing its connection to the old ways, the old knowledge, the old associations with calm and cleanliness and care. By the time we reached the 19th century, the world was changing rapidly in ways that would have astonished our medieval monks. The age of industry was arriving. Cities were growing larger than they had ever been. Science was discovering new things about how the world worked, how the body functioned, what caused disease. The old certainties were being questioned, the old explanations found wanting, and yet, through all this change, lavender persisted. It found, in fact, new prominence, new commercial importance, particularly in certain regions that had long cultivated it and understood its value. In southern France, in the region we call Provence, lavender had been grown for centuries. The climate there was ideal, hot, dry summers, plenty of sun, the kind of conditions lavender loves. The fields of Provence, stretching across the hillsides in neat purple rows, became famous throughout Europe. Visitors would travel there in summer just to see the lavender in bloom, to walk through those purple expanses, to breathe in the overwhelming scent. They built distilleries, those clever contraptions that use heat and water to extract the precious essential oil from the flowers. Where once lavender oil had been made by simple infusion, by steeping flowers in oil for weeks, now it could be distilled in hours, producing a much purer, more concentrated product. This lavender oil became central to an industry that was growing throughout the 19th century, perfumery. The great perfume houses of France, of Paris and Grasse, needed lavender oil for their creations. It was a fundamental note in many perfumes, valued for its clean, fresh scent, for the way it combined well with other fragrances, for its associations with cleanliness and refinement. So the lavender fields of Provence expanded, the distilleries multiplied, and lavender oil became a commodity, something traded, something with economic value, something that supported families and communities. The ancient plant had found a place in the modern commercial world. In England, too, lavender maintained its importance, though in somewhat different forms. The English had long loved lavender, had planted it in their gardens, had used it for all the traditional purposes we have discussed. But in the Victorian era, lavender became particularly associated with domesticity, with the proper running of a household, with the ideals of cleanliness and order that the Victorians valued so highly. English lavender water became famous, produced commercially and sold in bottles, used to scent linens, to freshen rooms, to dab on the temples when one had a headache. Lavender sachets were placed in every drawer, every wardrobe. Lavender soap became common, carrying that clean scent into the daily ritual of washing. The scent of lavender became, in a sense, the scent of Victorian respectability, of the well-ordered home, of proper care and attention to detail. But lavender never entirely lost its medicinal associations, even as it became more commercial, more decorative. Household remedy books of the 19th and early 20th centuries continued to recommend lavender for the same purposes the ancient physicians had used it, for nervousness, for insomnia, for headaches, for digestive complaints. Every well-stocked medicine cabinet might have a bottle of lavender oil or lavender water to be used as needed for common ailments. The knowledge was maintained, passed down, kept alive, even as the world changed around it. Grandmothers taught granddaughters. Country people who had always relied more on plant remedies than on expensive doctors continued their traditional uses of lavender, and even as modern medicine developed, even as new drugs were discovered and synthesized, lavender held its place for minor complaints, for situations where gentle remedies were sufficient and preferred. And then, in our own time, something interesting has happened. There has been a revival of interest in these old plant remedies, a recognition that perhaps in our rush toward the new and modern, we had abandoned things of value. People began asking, might these traditional remedies have something to offer? Might the accumulated wisdom of centuries be worth paying attention to? This revival has been called by a new name, aromatherapy. The word is modern, coined only in the 20th century, but the practice is ancient, the use of aromatic plants and their oils for healing and well-being. It is, in essence, what healers have been doing for thousands of years, now given a new name, now studied with modern methods, but fundamentally unchanged in its essentials. And lavender, unsurprisingly, has found itself at the center of this aromatherapy movement. Scientists have begun studying what our ancestors knew through experience, that lavender's scent does indeed have measurable effects on the nervous system, that it can reduce anxiety, promote sleep, ease certain types of pain. They have identified the compounds responsible, have measured the responses in the body, have provided explanations for what people have simply observed and trusted for millennia. This scientific validation is satisfying in a way. It is good to know that the old knowledge was sound, that when people said lavender helped them sleep or calmed their nerves, they were not imagining things. The effects are real, measurable, consistent with what centuries of use had already demonstrated. But I confess, I find something both gained and lost in this modern approach. Lost, perhaps, some of the wholeness, the integration of physical and spiritual, the sense that healing is not merely a chemical process, but a human encounter, a relationship between person and plant that transcends mere mechanism. The aromatherapist with their precisely measured drops of essential oil, their understanding of chemical compounds and their effects, their controlled clinical trials. They know things we did not know, but do they know, I wonder, what the monk knew when he walked through his garden at dawn, checking on each plant, feeling the connection between his care and the plant's thriving? Do they know what the grandmother knew when she sewed lavender into her granddaughter's pillow, an act of love as much as an act of medicine? Perhaps both kinds of knowing have their place. Perhaps we need the precision of modern science and the wholeness of traditional practice. Perhaps we need the chemical analysis and the accumulated wisdom of experience. Perhaps lavender, in its patient way, can bridge these worlds as it has bridged so many others. For that is what lavender has done throughout its long history with humanity. It has served as a bridge between the sacred and the practical, between the physical and the spiritual, between cleanliness and healing, between queenliness and healing, between anxiety and calm, between past and present, between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. It has maintained its presence, its usefulness, its value, across thousands of years of human history, through countless changes in how we understand the world and ourselves. It has adapted to new contexts while retaining its essential nature. It has moved from temple to monastery, to distillery, to laboratory, and in each place it has served, it has helped, it has brought some measure of comfort and relief to suffering humans. And it continues still. The lavender growing in gardens today is descended from that ancient wild lavender growing on Mediterranean hillsides. The uses we put it to are fundamentally the same as those of our ancestors. When we make lavender tea or rest our heads on lavender pillows or breathe in lavender's scent, we are participating in a practice that extends back beyond memory, beyond written record, to the first human who noticed this purple flower. This continuity, this unbroken thread connecting present to past, is remarkable when you consider it. So much has changed. The world our ancestors inhabited would be unrecognizable to us in many ways, but lavender remains familiar, reliable, continuing to offer what it has always offered: gentle relief, modest comfort, the scent of calm in a troubled world. And so I leave you with this thought: you are not alone in your use of lavender, whatever purposes you use it for. You are part of a long tradition, a vast company of humans across time who have turned to this plant for help and found it. Every time you breathe in lavender's scent, you are connected to all of them, to the Egyptian priest preparing his sacred ointment, to the Roman soldier treating his wound, to the medieval monk in his garden, to the Victorian lady freshening her linens, to all the countless, nameless people who simply wanted to sleep better, or worry less, or ease an aching head. You are heir to all that accumulated wisdom, all that patient observation, all that care. The knowledge was preserved for you, passed down through the generations so that you might benefit as they benefited. Lavender's gift to you is not just its chemical properties, useful as those are. It is also this connection, this sense of being part of something larger than yourself, something that transcends individual lives and links you to the great chain of human experience. And with that thought, I will take my leave. The hour is late, the candle burns low. You should be sleeping, if all has gone as I hoped. These words were meant to be tedious, deliberately slow, designed not to excite, but to calm, not to stimulate thought, but to ease it toward rest. If you are still awake, listening to these final words, then let them be the last you hear before sleep claims you. Let go of all effort now. Let go of all trying. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, nothing that cannot wait until morning. The night is for rest, and rest is what you deserve. Think, if you think at all, of lavender fields in Provence, stretching to the horizon, purple and peaceful under the summer sun. Think of the scent on the breeze, clean and calming. Think of all the hands that have tended these plants, all the people who have benefited from them, all the quiet moments of relief and comfort they have provided across the long centuries. You are held in that tradition now. You are surrounded by that accumulated care. Sleep now. Let these words fade. Let consciousness blur and drift. The ancient remedy does its ancient work. The scent, the tradition, the accumulated wisdom of millennia, all of this surrounds you, supports you, invites you to rest. Good night. And complete. Sleep well. The story is told. The journey is complete. The tedious history has served its purpose. If it has brought you to this moment, to this edge of sleep, to this place of letting go, rest now. All is well. Lavender watches over you as it has watched over so many before. Good night. Sleep.